The unsinkable Titanic didn't go down peacefully, which made finding its final resting place all the more difficult. The world-famous RMS Titanic sank in 1912, but was only discovered in 1985 on a secret mission. Although people back in the early 1900s had the approximate location of where the Titanic was, they didn't have the right technology to find it. As it went under, the ship sent several CQD signals, standing for Come Quickly, Distress, to a nearby ship named Carpathia. "Come at once, we have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man," were some of the final words transmitted from the Marconi wireless on the ship. These Morse code messages were also what made the first research missions to the wreck possible. RMS Carpathia found the lifeboats filled with Titanic survivors, but the world also desperately wanted to see what became of the famous liner. Fast forward to 1953. That's when the first serious attempt to find the Titanic wreck happened. A man named Risdon Beasley tried using a loud eruptive device to locate the ship. It sounds weird, but there's science to back it up. When dynamite goes off, the waves from the detonation hit the bottom of the ocean floor. With the help of sonars, scientists would be able to locate if there was anything solid at the bottom of the ocean. But Beasley had no luck. Another 20 years would pass before oceanographer Robert Ballard would make his attempt to locate the Titanic. Ballard had a bit more luck than Beasley. Over the previous years, underwater technology had gotten more funding and so worked much better. He tried it the first time in 1977. Ballard partnered with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on a mission to map the ocean floor. While the institute hired him to test out their new mapping technology, Ballard's intention was to go a little further and find the Titanic wreck. In the middle of this new technological ship, there was a hole that allowed for a long pipe to be extended into the water just above the ocean floor. Attached to the end of this pipe, Ballard installed a pod with sonars and cameras. They thought they were in for something big, and so they took the ship to sea to run some tests. That's when, on a trial run, adversity struck. The drill pipe broke, sending all of their expensive material to the bottom of the ocean floor, just like the Titanic. When Ballard failed, another important character came into this story, a man named Jack Grimm, an eccentric oil tycoon. Grimm had become famous for trying to find things such as Noah's Ark, the Loch Ness Monster, and Bigfoot. He also tried to prove the hollow Earth theory that says that the interior of Earth is entirely hollow and hosts underground cities and nations. His search consisted of trying to find a large hole on the North Pole and thus venturing inside the hollow Earth. After his attempts failed, he set his eyes on the jewel liner that had sunk, the RMS Titanic. Grimm had the money, but he didn't have the know-how. So, as a billionaire, he made a big donation to Columbia University and asked in return to use some of their equipment. He hired a team of highly qualified scientists to help operate the machinery. Here's where it gets a little strange. Jack Grimm was a believer in folklore and non-conventional ways of doing things. So he brought a monkey on board and surprised the research team. This monkey, called Titan, was believed to point to a map and locate lost things. In this case, the Titanic. The scientists went crazy when the monkey appeared and told Grimm it was either them or the monkey. This expedition left Florida without Titan. Yes, there would be no monkey business. They set the course to the exact location of Titanic's last distress signal. They arrived, examined every inch of the ocean floor, but still found nothing. Grimm's first expedition lasted 3 weeks, but unfortunately, they found absolutely nothing. They tried a particularly good search method known as mowing the lawn, where they mimic such movements to map every inch of a larger area around Titanic's distress coordinates. The reasons for failure were important defects in the equipment and terrible weather. That's when that prior searcher of the lost Titanic came back into the picture, Robert Ballard. He didn't have the millions Jack Grimm had, but he had one thing going for him. The marine geologist was working closely with the U.S. Navy to locate two nuclear submarines which had sunk in the 1960s. Ballard himself says he was living two lives, one as a researcher and the other as a Navy intelligence officer. The deal was simple. He'd have a green light to search for the Titanic after he found the two missing submarines. To find Thresher and Scorpion, he used an unmanned submarine vehicle called Argo. Argo was like a little snow sled. It was attached to a bigger ship that sailed above the water. Argo was connected to the ship by a long cable, and it was piloted by a team on board. The sled had sonars and cameras that provided real-time imaging of the ocean floor, so it was a real advancement on other attempts. After much thinking, he had a eureka moment. He supposed the force of the wreck should have left a comet trail that led back to the ship. While searching for the Titanic, most people had tried to find the ship itself. But until then, it had been trying to find a needle in a haystack. That's why Ballard's logic was so brilliant. He needed to invert the order. He had another obstacle on his hands: time. He could only look for the ship after finding the lost subs. And by the time that happened, he had 12 days left. He teamed up with another scientist, and they applied the mowing the lawn method to map the ocean bed. Another important piece of information that most researchers left out was that there was a sea current moving south on the day of the disaster. This meant that the debris field should be south of the distress signal coordinates. To save time and resources, he would do a quick reconnaissance of the ocean floor, spacing lines more than 3 miles apart to look for debris fields. He also relied more on the camera visuals than on the sonar signals. His team took turns piloting Argo and watching the video. Days rolled by, with nothing but the empty ocean floor showing up, until the rocks they were used to seeing started to look like man-made debris. Suddenly, there it was, the Titanic's boiler. Ballard was right. The debris field would take them back to the ship. After 73 years of searching, they had finally found the Titanic wreck.
Bet you never heard this story about the Titanic. So, this massive luxury ocean liner was heading out of Southampton on its first voyage to New York with over 2,000 passengers and crew on board. I'll spare you the details for now. You know how it all went down. Since there were a lot of things that went wrong during its short lifespan, some couldn't help but wonder, was it really bad luck? Or was there some mysterious force behind the ruckus? Well, for starters, right as it was leaving the harbor, the Titanic nearly crashed into another ship, called the SS New York. How did that happen? Well, 6 tugboats had to pull the massive Titanic into the river to begin its journey. Captain Smith was in charge, but let's be honest, he probably needed a few more cups of coffee before making any big decisions. So, as the Titanic was speeding along, minding her own business, she passed the New York and the Oceanic ships. The Titanic decided to make a left turn, but the suction was just too much for the poor New York. She started to drift off towards the Titanic. The Oceanic was leaning so much, her gangplank smacked into the water like a belly flop in the pool. Thankfully, the captain of one of the tugboats was there to save the day. He used his trusty megaphone to call the Vulcan to the port side of the Titanic to pick up some crew members. He then noticed the New York in trouble and acted quickly, throwing a line to slow her down. The Titanic's captain was probably scratching his head, wondering how to handle these big ships like the Titanic. That's because he'd only recently experienced sailing on larger ships. Close one, right? Well, it was just part of the story. As it turns out, the huge list of misfortunes might have started even earlier. Another theory suggests that during the ship's construction days in Northern Ireland, a fire broke out in the coal bunkers. Talk about a rocky start. If this information is correct, then the ship's hull may have been affected by the incident before it even set sail. Fans of this theory argue that a fire popped up inside one of the Titanic's large coal bunkers and really damaged an important segment of the ship's hull. Some claim there's even photographic evidence to back this up. A bunch of photos documenting how the ship was made and pampered for its maiden voyage were found, and they showed a significant black streak on the outside of the Titanic's hull. Weirdly enough, the streak was really close to where the iceberg hit during that cold April. Now I know what you're thinking. This theory might sound far-fetched, but most of these people have been gathering information about the Titanic for decades, and they're convinced that this is the real deal. They even believe that the fire started way earlier than the day the Titanic set out on its maiden voyage, particularly about 3 weeks prior. Why was this overlooked? Well, because of fear of bad press, mostly. Also, because of all the fuss created around the unsinkable ship, it was important that they stuck to the initial calendar. Of course, not everyone is convinced by this new theory. Some people think it's just another wacky idea to add to the long list of Titanic sensational theories. What if I told you there were even rumors about part of an ancient Egyptian coffin being on board? Could that have had something to do with the disastrous ending of the Titanic? Some truly believe it did. Let me tell you the story about the unlucky mummy. It's a tale that'll give you goosebumps. Back in the 19th century, this ancient Egyptian artifact, a mummy case lid to be exact, was brought over to Europe. And as soon as it arrived, strange things started happening. Now, some of the stories may be a bit exaggerated, but according to journalists, some of them were actually true. The rumors sparked the interest of a British writer who later spent months investigating the mummy case and its alleged related stories. He was planning to write an article debunking the myths, but he found out they were all too real. Unfortunately, he never got to finish his work because he passed away suddenly. Others believed that the mummy case was guarded by Egyptian elementals. They warned others not to mess with the artifact. The mummy case's history is just as spooky. It was found in Egypt and sold to a certain someone conveniently named Mr. W at a party organized by a well-known English lady. When the mummy case arrived in England, it was given to Mr. W's sister, who immediately suffered from financial losses and other troubles. A photographer who took a picture of the case claimed that he captured a living woman's face on the film. The mummy case eventually ended up in the British Museum, and it's still there today. However, rumors say that it was aboard the Titanic and was responsible for its sinking. But don't believe everything you hear. Some sources claim the mummy case never left the British Museum, and the rumor was started by a journalist named William Stead. He was actually a passenger on the Titanic, and he supposedly told his fellow passengers about the ill-fated mummy before the ship went down. Is that what happens when you tempt fate? Seriously doubt it, but it does make you wonder, doesn't it? It gets even weirder, trust me. About 50 passengers got cold feet before the ship took off, and they refused to board the Titanic at the last minute, even if it meant that they'd lose the cost of the ticket. They just had an extremely bad feeling about the whole deal, and even an Irish astrologer warned against making the voyage on the Titanic. I doubt he saw a big ol' iceberg hidden somewhere in the stars, but it does add up to the mystique surrounding the Titanic. And do you know what's even worse? The fact that the ship's binoculars, which could have helped prevent the iceberg collision, were locked up. Apparently, those binoculars could have been used by lookouts on that fateful night. But guess what? The key was held by David Blair, an officer who was sadly bumped from the crew before the ship's departure. Poor guy. He probably didn't even know what he was holding on to. Now, some historians think that if those binoculars were in use, the iceberg might have been spotted earlier. But hey, let's not point fingers here. Others argue that it wouldn't have made a difference. Who knows? Maybe the lookout was too busy looking at the stars to notice a giant iceberg in front of them. But seriously, what were they thinking? Locking up the binoculars on a ship that big is like forgetting to pack sunscreen for a trip to the beach. Also, the ship might have been going a bit too fast. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why was the captain in such a hurry? Well, apparently, good old Captain Smith was trying to beat his ship's older sibling, the Olympic, in a race to see which ship could cross the Atlantic faster. I guess he had a bit of a sibling rivalry going on or something. But here's the thing. Even though there were warnings about icebergs in the area, the Titanic just kept on chugging along at full speed ahead. I mean, come on, guys, it's not rocket science. If you know there are icebergs around, maybe slow down a little bit, right? And then, close to midnight on April 14th, 1912, the Titanic hit that iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. It also famously had a mere 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsible dinghies on board. No wonder it ended up being one of the worst maritime disasters in modern history. After the whole event, people started believing in life beyond the veil and contacted mediums, hoping for signs from the ones they had lost at sea. Can't say I blame them, though there's no verified story of someone managing to contact a Titanic passenger from the beyond, though. Back when it was built, the Titanic was one of the largest and most luxurious passenger ships, with high-class features like a grand staircase, a swimming pool, and a gymnasium. People thought it to be unsinkable because of its advanced safety devices. Its tragic sinking on its maiden voyage in 1912 proved it wasn't at all the case. It wasn't until 1985 that the Titanic's wreck was finally rediscovered using state-of-the-art sonar technology. Ever since, thousands of items have been recovered from the Titanic, many of them being put on display or sold for auction. Things like jewelry, a life jacket, a menu from the ship's restaurant, or even a sample square of carpet from the first-class stateroom have all baffled the public and told stories of the many on-board people. Scientists have even tried to come up with strategies to get the Titanic back up, not because they want to put it up for display, but so it can be properly studied, and more importantly, to stop it from getting more and more damaged at the bottom of the ocean. Some have suggested filling the wreck with ping-pong balls to make it float, while others even considered injecting it with 198,000 tons of Vaseline. Another creative solution was proposed, the idea of using a giant claw or scoop to lift the Titanic. Nobody came up with this device. Using 500,000 tons of liquid nitrogen to trap it in an iceberg that would float to the surface was also considered, but all these potential strategies had to be eventually let go, since the Titanic is way too fragile to ever be recovered. As the Titanic's iconic bow railings are in danger of collapsing, metal-eating bacteria continue to chew away at the ocean liner's wreckage. An undersea exploration company plans to gather data about the ship's deterioration in annual expeditions. They hope this will help them learn more about the Titanic, and also more about the ecosystem that shipwrecks create. The over 100-year-old ocean liner is also being damaged by deep-sea currents daily. Some experts predict that the ship could disappear in a few decades due to holes in its hull. The deck that passengers crowded on as the ship sank has caved in. The gymnasium near the grand staircase has also fallen in, and a 2019 expedition found that the captain's bathtub, which became visible after the outer wall of the captain's cabin fell away, is no longer there. Those annual expeditions also gather data about the creatures living at the site, including crabs and corals. Surprisingly, many species have only been seen there at the Titanic wreck, so scientists are curious to find out more about them. The most famous out of all these creatures is the Halomonas titanicae. It's a bacteria, and it was discovered on the wreckage of the Titanic. What's interesting about this creature is that it's able to thrive in extremely salty environments. It's also been resistant to several antibiotics, unlike other types of bacteria. It's probably because of this superbacteria that the deterioration of the ship's iron hull happened so fast. The expedition will also look at the debris field and its artifacts. On the site, there are still traces of little personal items like clothes and luggage. One of the most interesting stories about Titanic artifacts is that of the passengers' shoes. Most of the Titanic items that have been lost at sea deteriorated or disappeared completely. But not the shoes. They seem to be able to resist the harsh conditions. On top of that, The leather in most shoes is perfectly preserved, probably because of tannin, a substance used in the tanning process of leather. It helped the shoes resist the damaging bacteria found underwater. All this exploring might have gotten you all excited. If that's the case, I have some good news to share. You might even be able to join the expeditions. To personally explore the Titanic, you have to plan ahead and apply to be a mission specialist with OceanGate, the company responsible for the journey. However, this experience does come with a high price tag of $250,000. Despite the cost, this once-in-a-lifetime experience is in high demand because of the limited spots available. If you can afford the exploration, you will have the chance to collaborate with renowned specialists in marine biology, oceanography, the Titanic, DNA, and the deep ocean. Accommodations and meals on the dive support vessel are also included, as well as training and guidance from specialists before and during the mission. Lastly, you don't even need to bring your own gear, as the expedition equipment is included as well. Sure, ships have evolved and modernized over the years, and these days we have technology that is way better than that available on the Titanic. But this ship remains an amazing piece of history because of its many unusual features, like the fact that the Titanic's whistle was loud enough to be heard over 11 miles away, or the fact that the ship's hull was painted with a special mixture of red lead and linseed oil, which was believed to be effective in preventing the growth of seaweed and other marine organisms. However, despite popular belief, the ship's iconic fourth smokestack was not functional and was only used for ventilation and aesthetics. Probably one of its biggest flaws was its number of lifeboats. Despite its size and luxury, the Titanic only had 20 lifeboats on board, which were not enough to save all of its passengers and crew once it hit the iceberg. The Titanic may be the most famous shipwreck, but it's not the only one. The fleet of Kublai Khan tells a similar story. This one was a large naval force commissioned by the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan in the 13th century. The fleet was intended to travel to Japan and establish the Mongols as powerful rulers in the region. However, in 1281, the fleet was supposedly caught in bad weather and was seriously damaged, with many ships being destroyed. Legend has it that the fleet was torn down by a massive typhoon that came to be known as the kamikaze, or divine wind. This strong storm was believed to have been sent by the higher spirits to protect Japan from the Mongols. The truth about its disappearance remains a mystery to this day. However, the wreckage of the fleet, or parts of it, appears to have been discovered in the 1980s by Asian archaeologists. They dug across the site and studied the remains of the ships at a location near Imari Bay. The shipwreck is, to this day, considered to be an important archaeological discovery. That's because it informed us how well prepared the Mongols were back in the day in terms of their ships. Another tragic story is that of the RMS Empress of Ireland. This was a British passenger ship that operated until May of 1914. This is when the ship was sailing from Quebec City to Liverpool, but it ran into the Norwegian collier SS Storstad in the fog off the coast of Rimouski, Quebec. The collision caused a large hole in the side of the Empress of Ireland, and the ship began to quickly take on water and sink. The crew and passengers were caught off guard, and many were unable to evacuate in time. In total, 1,012 people were lost in the disaster, making it one of the worst maritime collisions in Canadian history. Rescue efforts were hampered by poor visibility and the fact that many of the lifeboats were damaged or unusable. Only 465 people survived the sinking, and many of them were rescued by the Storstad, which had remained in the area despite its damage. The sinking of the Empress of Ireland was a national tragedy in Canada, and it led to changes in maritime safety regulations and the establishment of a Coast Guard. The ship still lies at the bottom of the St. Lawrence River, where it has become a popular dive site for enthusiasts.
In the Titanic movie, you won't see any fumes above the fourth funnel of the legendary ocean liner, and it's not a mistake. Back in 1911, the year before the Dream ship's departure, large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the 4th was added for balance and more impressive looks. The White Star Line thought the public would have been disappointed to see only 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The Titanic's sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic, also had 1 fake funnel each for the same reason. The dummy chimney wasn't completely useless and served for ventilation. It took out the fumes from the machine spaces in the lower decks and from one of the first-class general rooms. 1 big ventilation funnel, instead of several small ones, helped to declutter the upper decks and left more open space for passengers to enjoy their strolls. When Titanic went down, the funnels, each weighing 60 tons, went down with the rest of the ship. They were made extra tall to make sure the passengers weren't covered in the suit being ejected. Their height and weight let them stay in the upright position. The forward funnel, followed by the others, fell only when the ship went for the final dive. Those chimneys were much lighter than the bow, so they spread among other debris. The light material they were made of flattened once it hit the bottom, and the iron-eating bacteria living deep down took care of it later. The bow of Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled. When the famous ocean liner hit that iceberg, things got really messy. It took the future movie star a whole 2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, the damaged compartments were spilling water into others, and it was chaos because these compartments were only watertight horizontally. Soon enough, water started flooding through the anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking, and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went underwater, and the stern shot up almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china or falling gear. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing almost 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. The bow was cruising down at about 13 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost a half an hour before the stern. The 2 parts of the Titanic now lie 2,000 feet apart, pointing in different directions. The bow remained mostly intact, just covered in mud. The stern turned into a tangled wreck because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Signal rockets played a big part in the Titanic's tragedy. When a ship goes down, you're supposed to shoot up red flares to signal trouble. But someone decided to stock Titanic with white lights instead of the usual red ones. So when the ship smacked into that iceberg, the crew fired off white flares. The SS Californian was passing nearby, and its captain knew the Titanic was in a dangerous iceberg zone. The crew didn't spot the sinking Titanic, but they sure saw those white rockets. The radio between the ships was useless because the Californian's operator switched it off. The captain had a gut feeling something was off, so he flashed a Morse code light signal at Titanic. But he received no reply because the Titanic had already gone underwater. There was another ship, Samson, sailing alongside the Titanic. It had plenty of illegally hunted frozen seal meat from Canadian waters abroad, so it was sailing with lights off to remain unnoticed. When they saw the Titanic's white rockets, they thought it was the Coast Guard and zoomed away. Samson didn't have a radio, so they couldn't find out about the ongoing disaster. The crew got the news about Titanic only when they got to the coast of Iceland the following month. There have been many theories to explain the Titanic tragedy, and one of the recent ones says that there was a fire involved. An Irish journalist went full detective for decades, digging into the mystery, and stumbled upon a game-changer. He came across a photo album that had been hiding from the public for a century after the tragedy. In the pictures, taken at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, just over a week before the liner sailed, you can clearly see a massive 30-foot black spot on the ship's hull. Maloney researched the photos and eyewitness testimony from the time and claimed that a fire spontaneously broke out inside of one of Titanic's enormous coal bunkers. It was raging for a whole 3 weeks and messed with the metal, critically weakening a crucial segment of the ship's hull. Back then, most ships had just one hull, so it was the only skin the Titanic had. That's why the Iceberg managed to punch a hole through the ship so easily. If it hadn't been for the fire, the Titanic might have shrugged off that iceberg collision. The company operating the liner knew about the fire, but they decided to conceal that fact. They didn't want any negative stories in the press as they faced some serious competition in transatlantic voyages. The Titanic was sold out, so they stocked up on coal and made it sail. The moon might have also played a role in the sinking. Our satellite heavily affects tides on the Earth. The closer it is to our planet, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of the moon. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide. During new and full moons, the alignment of the moon, the Earth, and the Sun makes their combined gravity reach its peak. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the Sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. It created the perfect conditions for the icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers to move freely. Opponents of this theory say that the difference in tidal force wasn't actually that big, and it couldn't have been the main cause of the sinking. The iceberg tore down the side of the ship, leaving a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. Some experts believe the ship would have survived the iceberg if it had hit head-on. The Titanic had watertight compartments designed to prevent flooding in case of a collision. Only the first 3 or 4 of these compartments would have been flooded. This could have helped save a lot of lives. Supporters of this theory put the blame for the disaster on First Officer William Murdoch. Huge, fast-moving ships don't just turn in a matter of seconds like a speeding car. It takes minutes. When Murdoch realized the collision was inevitable, he tried dodging left to avoid a direct hit. But despite his efforts, the ship still collided with the iceberg. You know the rest. It seems like we all cried watching the heartbreaking goodbye of Jack and Rose from the Titanic. Oops, spoiler, sorry. But the real-life stories from the sinking of the famous ship were no less touching. Joseph LaRoche was born in 1886 in Haiti to a wealthy family. He was growing up without a dad, but his mother was a self-made woman and a respected merchant. His uncle was the head of his country. Joseph was fluent in French, Creole, and English. At the age of 15, Joseph realized he wanted to become an engineer. There were no engineering schools in Haiti, so he moved to France to get his education. The journey took him a whopping 83 days. Still, in his student years, Joseph met Juliet in a suburb of Paris through a mentor. They soon became friends, and then it grew into something bigger. The couple decided to get married. There was only one problem. Joseph couldn't find a well-paid, qualified job even after completing his studies because of racial discrimination. The intelligent young man realized he could do better. Plus, he needed to provide for his growing family. His third kid was on the way. His uncle back in Haiti promised he'd help Joseph secure a job as a mathematics professor. His mother was overjoyed that her son and his family would be living in Haiti. She bought them first-class tickets for the French liner La France as a reunion gift. But that liner had really weird rules separating parents from their offspring for meals. The LaRoches didn't want to leave their youngsters and make them feel sad on a trip across the ocean. So they decided to trade their first-class tickets for La France for second-class tickets for RMS Titanic's maiden voyage. The Titanic was all the hype, and it didn't separate families, so it looked like a great deal. They planned to change for another ship in New York that would take them straight to their final destination in Haiti. The family boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912, at Cherbourg. They had 3 days to enjoy the luxurious staterooms, a dining salon, a library, and 3 outdoor promenade decks available to second-class passengers. Juliet sent a letter to her father from Titanic's final stop in Queenston, Ireland. She told him they were more than happy with the accommodation. They had 2 bunks in their cabin and a couch that converted into a bed for their youngest family members. The family made friends with some nice co-passengers with whom they had traveled together from Paris. She thought they had been the only other French people on board, so they sat together for meals. Juliet mentioned they had all spent time together on the deck of the liner. She also wrote the people on board were friendly, although some sources say the family had gone through quite a lot of mean stares, gossip, and remarks. On the night of April 14th, their exciting journey came to an abrupt end. Even though Titanic's wireless operators had received warnings about drifting ice from nearby ships, the liner continued to plow ahead at full throttle. It was around 11:40 p.m. when Titanic's hull collided with the Iceberg around 370 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The practically unsinkable ship was severely under-equipped with lifeboats, enough for only about half of its 2,200 passengers. The nearest rescue ship, the Carpathia, was too far away to help. A steward woke up the LaRoche family and took them to the lifeboats, as Juliet remembered later. She couldn't speak any English, so everything that was going on seemed even scarier to her. A little after midnight, the crew received the order to give priority to women and children when boarding the lifeboats. Juliet later remembered a terrible panic had begun, as people had been pushing each other to get to the desired seat. At some point, she felt they had pulled away her older daughter and thrown her into the abyss. A moment later, she had joined her Simone in the same emptiness. So, pregnant Juliet and her 2 daughters got spots in Lifeboat 14. But they had to say goodbye to Joseph as the boat was being lowered into the sea. He wrapped his coat around Juliet, saying she'd need it, and promised to get in another lifeboat and see her and the little ones again in New York. The 25-year-old Joseph LaRoche didn't manage to stay true to his word. In a couple of hours, Titanic sank underwater, taking the lives of almost 1,500 people. Joseph was one of them. Juliet and the girls were among the 700 survivors who had been rescued by the Cunard liner Carpathia several hours later. Once they reached New York, they were looking through the crowds of people, hoping to see Joseph again. When it became obvious they wouldn't find him, it was time for them to decide what to do and where to go. Without any knowledge of English or money that had gone down with the ship, Juliet managed to survive in America only for 3 weeks, and then had no other choice but to go back to France. Joseph's uncle was no longer able to help them, as others had taken his life 4 months after the Titanic tragedy. In December 1912, Juliet gave birth to a son who she named Joseph after his father. For the rest of her life, she couldn't get over the loss of her beloved husband. That's why she didn't like to speak about what had happened on Titanic and told her children not to mention it. In 1995, a member of the Titanic Historical Society interviewed Louise, who was the last remaining LaRoche child and the last French survivor of the sinking. And that's when the world first heard about this heartbreaking story. It inspired some plays and articles, but it never got the same attention as the story of other passengers. You probably remember the elderly couple going down together in their bed on the Titanic. It was inspired by Isidor and Ida Strauss. They were both born in Germany and emigrated to the United States as kids. They met in New York and got married 5 years later. Isidor started a china and porcelain business with his brother that grew into the glassware department at Macy's and turned them into multimillionaires. Isidor and Ida were well known in New York, not only for their wealth and charity, but also for their love and devotion to each other. In 1912, the couple decided to run away from the New York winters and headed for Europe. By that time, they'd already been married for 40 years. In early April, it was time for them to sail back home to New York. They normally traveled on huge German liners, but at that time, they couldn't resist the hype of everyone talking about that new luxury liner, the RMS Titanic. That's how they ended up in one of the first-class private suites at the top of the ship. The Strauss couple spent their evenings dining in front of a live orchestra in a hall filled with fancy furniture and expensive wooden paneling. On the night of April 14th, they felt a slight tremor and then left their private suite and waited for instructions from the crew. They told the passengers not to lose their passes, as they'd need them when everyone got back on board. But the ship was going under. The Strauss couple were standing next to Lifeboat 8. Mr. Strauss, who was 67 at the time, was offered a seat with his wife because of his age. He refused it, saying he was not too old to sacrifice himself for a woman. He wanted to wait and make sure no women and kids were left behind. Ellen Bird, Ida's maid, hesitated before getting on the lifeboat, but Ida told her to go. She took the easy decision not to leave her husband on the sinking ship. Ida took off her beautiful mink coat and handed it to her shivering maid, saying she wouldn't be needing it anymore. Isidore didn't manage to convince her to save herself, so they stayed together till the end. Some of the surviving first-class passengers later remembered they had seen the couple standing peacefully on the deck, holding hands, just waiting.
New exclusive photographs, by far the best yet, are in from the Titanic. For most of this century, that...
When the first images of the Titanic shipwreck appeared in September 1985, the world stopped. People were glued to their TVs, watching the legendary ship reappear after more than 70 years. Where did the Titanic sink, you ask? It's located about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. This so-called unsinkable ship rests in complete darkness, about 12,600 feet below the surface. Yep, that's how deep the Titanic is. But even after such a long fall down to the ocean floor, the front part, known as the bow, still looks surprisingly intact. I mean, the railings were still there, the anchor chains too, even the elegant curves of the hull you might recognize from old photos. But the news barely mentioned the stern back then, and there's a reason we still don't talk much about it. You see, these images were about more than just capturing mesmerizing and eerie footage. They were proof of what really happened when the Titanic sank. We were finally getting some answers about this 1912 disaster, when more than 1,600 people lost their lives. And before you Google how many people survived the Titanic, I'll tell you, 706. Among those survivors, several claimed they saw the ship break apart as it went down. Others insisted it sank in one piece, and in the end, investigators agreed with them. Back then, official reports concluded that Titanic had gone down intact. So, for 73 years, that was the official story, until we finally saw the Titanic at the bottom of the ocean. When the Titanic underwater photos were released, they confirmed it. Yes, the liner really did break apart as it sank. And if we've just seen those images of the bow, that means the stern must be around there too, right? Well, kind of. I mean, we did find it. It's located about 2,000 feet away from the bow, lying on the ocean floor. So yes, it exists. But why doesn't anyone ever talk about what happened to the stern of the Titanic? Well, there's a big reason for that. See, the bow, even after all the damage from hitting the seafloor, still looks recognizable. Many of its interiors are surprisingly well preserved, and it's lying as if the ship was continuing its voyage. But the stern is destroyed. Today it's more like a twisted tangle of steel that barely looks like a ship at all. Only the parts that are more resilient, like the propellers, reciprocating engines, and rudder, have managed to hold their shape, but the rest of the stern section is melting into the seafloor. Yet, to understand why it's in such a terrible state, we need to go back to that freezing night of April 15, 1912, the night of the Titanic wreck. Just hours before the tragedy, Titanic was still sailing smoothly across the cold North Atlantic. The stern was alive with people, families talking, music playing, life going on as usual. This is where the room for passengers with the cheapest tickets were located. That's why third-class travelers were also known as steerage passengers. But the stern wasn't only for passengers. It also contained many of the ship's storage areas, including cargo holds, baggage rooms, kitchens, crew quarters, and even the engineering spaces. And hold on to that info, it's going to be important in a second. So let's jump straight to when the liner struck the iceberg. As the bow began to sink, the stern slowly lifted out of the water, putting enormous strain on the middle of the ship. By around 2 in the morning, the lights on Titanic flickered and then went out. Moments later, the ship broke in two, and the bow disappeared beneath the waves. The stern briefly settled back on the water before rising again, this time almost vertical. It stayed upright for a few seconds and then began its final plunge. At about 2:20 in the morning, the stern vanished beneath the Atlantic. Titanic was gone. What was happening beneath the water were two completely different scenarios. First, the bow slowly filled with water and began to drift downward, almost sailing gently like a submarine. Because of that, it managed to keep its shape and stayed mostly intact. But Titanic's stern collapse was a whole different story. The stern was ripped wide open where the ship had split apart. Water rushed in through that open end at incredible speed. This sudden flooding made the stern plunge downward much faster than the bow. The rush of water created so much turbulence that pieces were ripped off and scattered all around the ocean floor. Now, remember what I said earlier about the spaces inside the stern? Those huge storage areas were wide open, and many of them contained air pockets. So when the stern section broke away, it still had compartments filled with trapped air. As it spun down into the depths, this increasing water pressure crushed those pockets one by one. The surrounding structure began to implode, scattering pieces of metal, furniture, statues, and passengers' belongings across the ocean floor. So many experts believe the immense water pressure made that section collapse as it sank, and that's why we can't see much of it today. And now you know the answer to the Titanic back section mystery. We don't talk about it much, simply because there's not much left to see. It's like the part of the Titanic story that's too broken or too painful to talk about openly. The side of the ship that truly feels lost. And sorry to say this, but that's the future of the bow, too. I mean, it won't be there forever. The iconic shape of the wreck is changing year after year, and not in a good way. The front part of the Titanic is deteriorating, and one day it'll be entirely gone. Down on the seabed, the Titanic faces enormous pressure, nearly 390 times greater than at the surface. The good news is there aren't any air pockets left inside the ship, so big implosions won't happen again. But the bad news is that the ship's own weight is now helping to tear it apart. As those 52,000 tons of steel slowly settle into the ocean floor, they twist and pull on the hull. Submersible missions have already spotted large cracks running through the steel plates, and even the decks themselves are starting to cave in. And there's something else. The wreck might look cool and spooky today, but that actually comes from a thick layer of bacteria and microbes covering it. The problem is, they're slowly eating the Titanic. Yep, most of the corrosion happening down there is caused by bacteria, and this is gradually weakening the entire structure. Steel plates, beams, and supports are getting thinner every year. Scientists estimate that the ship is losing between 0.13 and 0.2 tons of iron every single day. Still, even at that rate, the wreck won't vanish overnight. Experts believe it could take up to 420 years for the liner to disappear completely. Until then, we'll keep watching this sad but natural process unfold. Parts of the ship have been falling apart little by little since the night when Titanic sank, and a lot has already changed since we started taking underwater photos, like the railing sections that have dropped and the ceiling in the captain's bathroom that's collapsed. That's why so many expeditions are now focused on capturing footage and detailed scans of the Titanic shipwreck to preserve its memory before the ocean takes it all. It's our way of keeping the story alive, even as time and nature continue their quiet work. Maybe those hungry bacteria can take a break from their buffet, so that Titanic can rest in peace with many more years to come.
On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail from England. But this wasn't the launch of a regular ship. The Titanic was the largest liner ever built at the time. It was 882 feet long. That's nearly the size of 3 soccer fields. And measured from the hull to the top of the smokestacks, the ship was an impressive 175 feet tall. That's the size of a 17-story building. Deemed unsinkable, it took 3,000 workers almost 3 years to build. But a mere 4 days into its very first voyage, at 11:40 p.m., the ship collided with an iceberg and was lost beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. It took the liner only 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. And of more than 2,200 passengers and crew members on board, only 706 survived. The wreck would remain lost for another 73 years, hiding its many secrets within the frigid Atlantic waters. And if it wasn't for a man whose whole life had been devoted to exploring the sea, the giant ship might have remained lost for a lot longer. That man was Robert Ballard. As a child, Ballard was obsessed with the ocean. This fascination started when he was just 12 years old. That's when he watched a film adaptation of Jules Verne's science fiction novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It had everything to spark a young person's imagination, from adventure and strange creatures to a powerful underwater vehicle called the Nautilus. It could travel anywhere in the world you wanted to go. From that moment, life on dry land was no longer in Ballard's future. When he was 23, he was assigned to the Deep Submergence Group. There, he helped develop techniques to search the ocean floor. His biggest accomplishment was the creation of Alvin. It was a small, easy-to-maneuver submarine that could carry 3 people. It also featured an external mechanical arm designed to gather underwater samples while the crew remained safe and dry inside. Alvin the submarine quickly proved useful for a variety of tasks. For example, once it was used to track down an aircraft that had crashed into the sea. But the vessel experienced a series of setbacks. In one case, it was attacked by a swordfish, which caused the submarine to resurface quickly. The swordfish, still stuck in the outer skin of the submarine, became that night's dinner. And in October 1968, the submarine was being lowered into the water when the cables holding it snapped, sending it careening into the ocean along with 3 crew members on board. And because the small vessel was still open, it immediately filled with water and quickly began to sink. Luckily, the crew managed to escape, but Alvin was gone. Bad weather hampered multiple attempts to recover the vessel. It wasn't until the following year that it was finally returned to the surface. In time, Alvin would be improved. Its hull would be strengthened by titanium, giving it a higher depth rating, thus making it even better suited for ocean exploration. The specialized submarine would come in handy in many of Ballard's 100-plus expeditions. The man was one of the first to explore an underwater mountain chain called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in the Atlantic Ocean. And when he found thermal vents in the Galapagos Rift in the late 70s, he also helped discover and document the process of chemosynthesis. That's a complicated chemical synthesis of food energy by bacteria. But his biggest discovery was still to come. Ballard claimed he'd never been a Titanic fanatic, but he eventually became obsessed with finding the ship after watching other explorers try and fail. As he said, Titanic was clearly the big Mount Everest at the time. Many others had tried, many that I thought would have succeeded, or should have succeeded but didn't. Ballard began thinking about finding the ship as early as 1973, and 4 years later, he actually made an attempt. He used the deep-sea salvage vessel Sea Probe, which was a drill ship equipped with cameras and sonar. But he was forced to give up when the drilling pipe broke. It just wasn't his time. In the early 80s, a Texas oil man named Jack Grimm tried to find the wreck on 3 different occasions. Once, Grimm was actually right over the Titanic, but his equipment failed to detect it. That's what we call extreme bad luck. Ballard was just biding his time. He needed a plan and some help. The first issue was getting down to the bottom of the Atlantic. The furthest down he had ever traveled before was 20,000 feet, and this trip took him 3 hours, and that didn't include the way back up. Ballard knew he could use Alvin, already enhanced with a titanium hull, to withstand the pressure of the ocean. But he also needed something that didn't require him to actually go down with it. An unpiloted, remote-controlled submarine would be ideal. But first, he would have to create one. He reached out to the authorities, hoping they would provide funding for his project. And though officials had no interest in the Titanic, they were willing to help. But there was a catch. Ballard had to first focus on tracking down 2 submarines, the Thresher and the Scorpion, which had sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in the 1960s. The authorities were hoping to study them to find out why they had sunk in the first place. They also wanted to know if they could be recovered or if it was safe to leave them on the ocean floor. Only when he had successfully completed this task would he be free to use any remaining time on his contract to find the Titanic. With no other options for funding, Ballard took the offer. He got to work. First, he created 2 new devices. Argo was an unpiloted, deep-towed undersea video camera sled. It was designed to take photos and record videos from a series of cameras mounted on it. It could work at depths of up to 20,000 feet, and it could also explore nearly 98% of the ocean floor. Argo was supposed to be tethered to a boat. As the boat moved, Argo would be pulled behind, floating just above the ocean floor. The camera would then transmit images to the surface. The second device was a small robotic vehicle called Jason Jr. It was also controlled remotely, which allowed the crew inside a submarine, like Alvin, to get closer to and photograph underwater objects. Ballard was now ready. He knew he had to find those submarines quickly, and it didn't take him long. Much to his relief, the search was relatively simple, and he was able to fulfill his obligations with 12 days to spare. With almost 2 weeks to devote to finding the Titanic, he set out to explore the ocean. He focused the search close to Newfoundland, Canada, pulling Argo along the ocean floor and reviewing the images it collected. And after a few days of nothing, they eventually found riveted hull plates and a boiler. Could this be it? The next day, a ship's large bow was revealed. On September 1st, 1985, Ballard and his fellow crew members realized they had finally found the infamous ship. The discovery resulted in a mix of emotions. Ballard was excited to be the first to find the Titanic's final resting place, but he was also overwhelmed by the sense of grief for those who had suffered when the ship had gone down. Over the next 4 days, the crew explored the wreck. They found the crow's nest, from where the iceberg had first been spotted. Plus, there was finally evidence of how the massive ship had split in 2 before sinking, with both halves of the ship found. There was furniture and dinnerware, and sadly, several leather shoes of those who hadn't made it to safety were scattered about the ocean floor. Ballard succeeded where others had failed and became an instant celebrity around the world. You'd think that locating the Titanic would be enough for one man, but not for Ballard. In 2019, he took on the challenge of solving another mystery, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. Earhart had attempted to be the first woman to fly around the world. Unfortunately, she disappeared somewhere over the Pacific Ocean in 1937. She and her plane were never found. Ballard hoped that his luck with the Titanic would help with finding where Earhart had gone down, but his expedition failed to find anything. And though Robert Ballard has found more shipwrecks than anybody else, it's only the tip of the iceberg. It's estimated that there are over 3 million shipwrecks in the ocean, and Ballard has only located 100 of them. Now in his late 70s, the man is hoping to encourage young people to continue his work of exploring the ocean and its many mysteries. In 1989, he started the Jason Learning Project to inspire grade school students to pursue science, technology, engineering, and math. He has his own research vessel called the EV Nautilus, after the name of the submarine in Jules Verne's novel, a fitting tribute to the story that inspired his career.
Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, but not many people know that Titanic had two sister ships, and that on the night of its sinking, one of them was rushing to help but didn't make it in time. Bad luck seemed to follow the trio of ships, but each one of them had glorious moments that live in the minds of those who sailed in them. Keep on watching to discover a story of awe, ingenuity, and ill fate. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn notifications on to join us on the bright side of life. You know how the iceberg hit the Titanic, how the band played to the end, and how the whole tragedy unfolded, but before it happened, it would have seemed an impossibility for such a ship to meet the end it did. None of that could have been foreseen by White Star Line, the company who built the Titanic, who had high hopes for what the unsinkable ship and its sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic, would accomplish. The Olympic was the first of the trio to make sail on June 11, 1911, heading towards New York. The sheer size of it would wow the crowds. The Olympic's maiden voyage went without incident, and a crowd of 8,000 people in New York got to explore its luxurious accommodations while it was docked there. There were high expectations for the massive ship, but just around 2 months later, the Olympic crashed with the HMS Hawk. The Hawk got the brunt of the damage, as the bow was left flat as a pancake. After the crash, the Olympic made its way slowly back to Belfast, where the Titanic was being constructed. On the dock, people could see the two enormous ships side by side, as parts of the Titanic were used to put the Olympic back in shape. A rare sight to behold. And on April 14, 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg, and minutes later, the crew radioed nearby ships for help. That night, the Olympic was returning from New York when it received the distress signal. The ship turned around and rushed at full speed towards the Titanic, but they were so far away that they would have arrived next night. At some point during the early hours of April 15, 1912, the crew of the Olympic decided they wouldn't make it in time and stopped course. The survivors of the Titanic were eventually rescued by the Carpathia. Olympic was set up with lifeboats for all crew and passengers after the Titanic sank. It went from having 20 lifeboats to 64. Changes were also made to the watertight bulkheads, and an extra hull to construct a type of double hull was installed. It was determined that a double hull would have kept the Titanic from sinking. For several years, Olympic was used in the war effort against Germany. Throughout the years, Olympic carried over 200,000 passengers, which included thousands of Americans fleeing from Europe and troops battling during World War I. One of the most significant moments for this ship was when it struck a German submarine and sank it. It was discovered that the submarine was preparing to fire a torpedo on the Olympic before Olympic rammed it. The Olympic ended up sailing the seas for 3 decades, which earned her the nickname of the Old Reliable, despite some previous accidents. It went on to help the survivors on the HMS Audacious when it was sinking, and do what it couldn't for its sister, Titanic. Eventually, bad luck caught up with the Olympic. The ship crashed with the Nantucket Lightship, and the crash signaled the beginning of the end. Beaten up, and after years of service, the Olympic was demolished and scrapped for parts. The Old Reliable saw many years of service and thousands of passengers, but the Britannic's journey was shorter-lived. When the Titanic sank, White Star Line was faced with a problem, since they already had another enormous ship in the works. White Star Line began construction on the HMHS Britannic on November 30, 1911, around 4 months before the Titanic sank. Although the Britannic was the youngest of the trio of ships, having been constructed last, it was also the biggest. They intended to name it Gigantic, but after the Titanic's disaster, they changed the name to Britannic, since they considered it to be a lucky name. With the Titanic sinking, the White Star Line underwent rigorous investigation, and many changes were made to the Britannic's design. The Britannic looked very similar to the Titanic, and it had what was at the time the largest marine turbine in the world, able to reach faster speeds than the Olympic. With Titanic's fate fresh in their minds, Everything possible was done to ensure the safety of this newer ship. The Britannic was eventually launched on February 26, 1914, almost 2 years after Titanic met its end. After the Titanic's disaster, the White Star Line wanted the Britannic to redeem their name. The Britannic was on its way to becoming a successful ship. It transported passengers for over a year and a half when the British government requisitioned it and turned it into a hospital ship during the beginning of World War I. The ship became an even more impressive sight to look at. It was painted all white, with enormous red crosses on its side to indicate it was a hospital ship. One of the ship's surgeons, Dr. J.T.H. Beaumont, thought of it as the most wonderful hospital ship that ever sailed the seas. It could treat as many as 3,309 patients at once. This is how the Britannic became His Majesty's Hospital Ship, or HMHS Britannic. Though the sight of this magnificent ship must have put a smile on a wounded soldier's face or two, the Britannic didn't operate for long. Just a year after it was turned into a hospital ship, the Britannic was making its way through the Aegean Sea to pick up wounded soldiers, when it was struck by a loud explosion. The passengers didn't know what had happened, but headed to the deck to disembark. It is unclear what hit the Britannic, but the general consensus is that it was struck by a mine left by a German U-boat, though some still believe a torpedo hit it. The captain tried to move the ship to a beach close by, but the ship was sinking fast. In the desperation, against the captain's orders, several crew members launched lifeboats and disembarked. But since the ship was moving and the propellers working, the lifeboats were sucked and destroyed by the propellers. Though so much effort had gone in to ensure the Britannic was safer than the Titanic, whatever explosion occurred left the Britannic in the same dire condition as the Titanic in just 10 minutes. In a cruel twist of fate, it also sank in the ocean. Unlike Titanic's enormous death toll, only 30 people perished in the sinking of the Britannic, and over 1,000 survived. So many people survived because the accident happened in the morning, when the temperature of the water was warmer and the Greek island Kea was close by to offer help. In the end, the Britannic only sailed the seas for over 2.5 years. The bad luck that followed the Titanic and the Britannic and the accidents and demise of the Olympic was remarkable. But what was most impressive is that there was a woman who sailed on all 3 ships and survived. Violet Jessup was a crew member and nurse aboard the ships. She was there when the Olympic collided with the HMS Hawk in 1911 and disembarked safely. 2 years later, she escaped the sinking of the Titanic in lifeboat number 16, and she showed some women it was safe to board the lifeboats. You'd imagine that would be enough to keep her from ever getting on a boat again, but not for her. A few years later, she served as a nurse in the Britannic while it was used as a hospital ship. When the explosion occurred, Violet jumped overboard, was pulled under by the water, and hit her head on the keel but survived. Can you imagine her experience? She must have had nerves of steel. All in all, the trio of ships saw journeys of triumph and tragedy. Ill fate might have followed them, but all the survivors were left with incredible stories to tell. So tell us, Brightsiders, would you have liked to have seen any of these ships in real life? Let us know in the comments section. Don't forget to give this video a like, share it with your friends, and click subscribe to stay on the bright side.
There were no binoculars on board the famous Titanic on the night when they were needed the most. The lookouts were blind, helpless, and doomed, and the ship went down, taking hundreds of lives, right? Well, it's just one of the many myths from a whole ocean of half-truths, rumors, and dramatic retellings the Titanic is still sailing in. There were binoculars on board. The real issue was access. The binoculars were locked in a cabinet in the crow's nest, which is the lookout point, but the key went missing. A crew member named David Blair, who was supposed to be on the Titanic, was reassigned to a different ship at the last minute. He forgot to leave the key behind. The key to saving hundreds of lives, literally, was sitting in his pocket far away as the Titanic was going down. But we'll never find out what would have happened if the key had been there. The sky was clear that night, but there wasn't a moon to light the way, and there was no wind, so the sea was glassy, and there were no ripples, which are the usual warning signs of icebergs floating around. Then there's the idea that the Titanic was racing across the Atlantic to break a speed record, but historians disagree. The Titanic's crew knew there was ice out there, but instead of slowing down, they just kept going, cruising around 22 knots. That's only a couple of knots slower than her top speed, but the Titanic wasn't being pushed to her limits. Many of her furnaces weren't even fully stoked.
And it was normal practice for that time to just keep going and trust those on the lookout to spot the ice before the ship hits it. Those massive Atlantic liners weren't about taking it easy. They were about being perfectly on time. Ships like the Titanic were basically the express trains of the sea, and any delay would have been a PR disaster. So, yeah, they knew the risks, but didn't think it was a big deal. After all, plenty of ships had close calls before and came out okay. They didn't see ice as a huge threat those days, and weren't even afraid of head-on collisions. And have you heard that the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, marketed it as unsinkable? In 1910, the company was hyping up their two new ocean giants, the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic. Their ads proudly declared these ships were designed to be unsinkable. What the company meant by it was that, on paper, the design should keep them afloat. Later on, they even had to clarify that they never promised the ships were actually unsinkable. By 1911, before the Titanic even hit the water, magazines were already running wild with the idea. Writers were calling her practically unsinkable, pointing to her fancy new watertight compartments as proof. And just like that, a legend was born before the ship even left the dock. After she went down, even one of White Star Line's own executives admitted during the official inquiry that when he first heard the news, he didn't believe it. He genuinely believed the Titanic couldn't sink. But that whole unsinkable thing was never the main selling point. White Star Line wasn't really pushing safety, but selling luxury. The Titanic was supposed to be the crown jewel of ocean travel, massive, elegant, and dripping in comfort. Another story that just stuck with us is that before the iceberg even struck, a coal fire was burning away in one of the Titanic's bunkers. It weakened the ship's hull and made it more vulnerable. Some people even say that fire caused or accelerated the sinking. Well, it's partially true. There was a coal fire in one of the Titanic's coal bunkers before the voyage. Fires in coal bunkers weren't unusual in steamships of the time. They could smolder for days. But it was nothing like a fire that would be raging uncontrollably. Historical timelines, crew logs, and structural analysis all indicate that a fire of such intensity and in such a position couldn't have caused fatal structural damage. If the fire had done that much harm, the ship might have failed even before the collision. But the Titanic stayed afloat for over 2 hours, which means the real villain was still the iceberg. Another twist to the fire story is that it could have distracted the crew, preventing them from dealing with the iceberg situation properly. That sounds more plausible, but still, that's not the same as saying the fire was the real culprit. Speaking of the real culprits, there's no doubt it was an iceberg, but the scale of disaster it caused was way more subtle than a big movie-style gash in the hull. Instead, it produced many tiny fractures in the ship's rivets, seams, and metal joints. Each fracture was almost unnoticeable, but because the ship was cruising, the water was steadily running through those micro gaps under pressure. It slowly seeped into multiple compartments and filled 6 of the watertight sections. The Titanic lingered, hovered, took on water, and was failing compartment after compartment. She sank over a period of 2 hours, rather than going down in minutes. If the iceberg had catastrophically torn open the hull, the ship would have gone down almost immediately, and people would have had no time to react and escape. Sadly, not all of them had that chance anyway. You probably recall the heartbreaking scene from the Titanic movie, where third-class passengers attempt to escape to the decks, but they are locked below in their section. Well, it's only partially true. Yes, there were barriers separating passenger classes, but they were mostly in place to comply with U.S. immigration laws. Third-class passengers going to America in search of a new life had to pass health checks and immigration processing. That's why they were traveling on separate decks. There were some lifeboats for them, although not in the third-class sections of the ship, so they would have to navigate a maze of corridors and stairs to reach the top. And many of the third-class passengers didn't even want to try, as they didn't want to leave their luggage behind. In the end, only about a quarter of the third-class passengers survived, but no one forcefully kept them on the lower decks. Now let's switch gears and discuss the Titanic facts that people used to deny or overlook, but which have since been proven true. For example, most deck plans and diagrams you've seen in Titanic documentaries don't show a hidden deck down under the waterline called the inner bottom. Many outside engineers did not fully understand or discuss it. This hidden deck stretched nearly the full length of the ship and had 44 separate watertight tanks. Most of them were for water ballast, some for fresh water. There were also wing tanks, port and starboard, which helped with balance. The inner bottom was like the ship's built-in organizer. It divided the Titanic into separate sections, allowing different parts to remain balanced and easier to control. It was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of the forward compartments flooded. Sadly, the rendezvous with the Iceberg opened 6 compartments, and you know what happened next. And finally, my personal favorite Titanic myth is that the ship split cleanly in half, like some Hollywood action scene. Blame James Cameron for that one. We all cried when we saw it, but reality was way uglier. For many years after the tragedy, survivors couldn't all agree on what they saw. Some said the ship went down whole. Others swore it broke apart. No one believed the second group until the scientists found the wreck in 1985. Then, they finally confirmed the truth that the Titanic had indeed broken in two, but not neatly. The metal twisted, tore, and shredded as the stern lifted into the air, and 2 opposite forces ripped it apart. And to make it even more tragic, the people were still clinging to the back half when it snapped and plunged into darkness.
It was 11:39 at night when the Titanic's lookout shouted, "Iceberg, right ahead!" Swift action on the bridge to reduce speed and change the ship's course didn't help, and you already know how the story ends. Since then, we've regarded what happened to Titanic as a once-in-a-lifetime event. Is it, though? The Titanic sank in 1912. Forget about fancy GPSs or weather satellites. At the time, ships were responsible for warning each other about the location of icebergs, like a "hey man, trust me on this" situation. Then the Titanic disaster happened. To call it a disaster is an understatement, so specialists felt the need to form an organization to avoid this kind of accident happening again. That's why, a year later, they created the International Ice Patrol, or IIP for short. Up to this day, this group has been responsible for giving ships advanced warnings about ice threats. IIP improved their methods over the years, from ship reports and aircraft patrols to satellite images. Recently, they've also been using oceanographic buoys, floating devices providing real-time information about ocean conditions up to 164 feet below the surface to predict the potential drift of icebergs. Luckily, IIP is doing an excellent job in reducing ship iceberg collisions. But don't get too comfortable, because even the most advanced detection equipment can't entirely avoid an unfortunate situation. Between 1980 and 2005, there were 57 incidents involving vessels and icebergs. And the chilling truth is that today's ships are more likely to run into an iceberg than the Titanic was. Studies have shown that 1,038 icebergs crossed the area where the Titanic sank back in 1912. You might think that's a lot, but scientists say it's not really a big deal. I mean, yeah, it's on the higher side, but there have been 14 years with even more iceberg activity since then. Nowadays, the number of icebergs is going up due to the accelerated melting of Greenland's glaciers. And since more ships are heading into polar waters, the chances of ships bumping into icebergs are higher. But the real danger for captains is invisible enemies, called growlers and bergy bits. Growlers are these small icebergs that can be the size of a regular door. And bergy bits are also considered small, measuring around the size of a school bus. These icebergs might seem harmless, but they're actually tricky since they can be completely invisible to radars or satellites. Let's see what happens when a modern cruise ship as big as the Titanic hits one of these small icebergs. Meet the Norwegian Sun, a luxurious cruise ship like Titanic, as it has the capacity to accommodate 2,400 passengers and more than 900 crew members. On July 2022, this cruise ship was on its way to Hubbard Glacier in Alaska when it found itself in the middle of a dense fog. Suddenly, passengers felt an impact and were terrified as the ship experienced a severe jolt. The fog immediately cleared and they realized what had happened. The Norwegian Sun had collided with an iceberg of the growler type. But the outcome was entirely different from Titanic. Thankfully, there were no injuries, and both the passengers and staff reached the Alaskan docks safely. Expert divers checked the condition of the boat, and they discovered that the ship had suffered some damage after the collision, so the rest of the trip was canceled. Now don't stress about packing for your next trip across the Atlantic, because accidents like the one with the Norwegian Sun are really rare. I mean, it's common for ships to encounter ice, but what's unusual is for it to be a problem. Most modern cruise ships wouldn't get physically damaged by an iceberg, and there's a reason for that. You see, the steel used in the Titanic also played a significant role in the disaster. The unsinkable ship, after all, was not so impact-resistant. Back then, the Titanic's hull was constructed using around 2,000 steel plates, which are believed to have been produced in an open hearth furnace. As a result, the steel contained a high concentration of phosphorus, oxygen, and sulfur. High levels of these elements make steel brittle at low temperatures, causing it to fail upon impact. While the steel used on the Titanic was of the highest quality available at the time, it wouldn't meet the safety standards of modern ships, and it was approximately 10 times less safe than what today's vessels use. But the most significant difference between the design of the Titanic and a modern ship lies in how the hull is put together. You see, the Titanic was built using over 3 million rivets for its hull and upper deck structure. So, when it struck the iceberg, the rivets started a chain reaction, causing the entire section of the hull to collapse simultaneously, causing an uncontrollable flood of water. In contrast, modern ships use a method called submerged arc welding, which fuses the edges of metal pieces together, creating a strong and continuous bond. This is safer because if any part of the ship gets damaged, the tear doesn't spread, making things worse. The damage remains contained within that section. Okay, so small icebergs are becoming more common, and vessels have been adapted to deal with them. But there's still one more scenario to consider. What if a huge cruise ship hit an iceberg the size of a 5-story building? Imagine we've just created the world's largest cruise ship on the planet. Let's call it the Bright Seaside. Our floating resort is massive, 4 times the size of the Statue of Liberty. It's longer than the Titanic by 318 feet and carries about 3 times more passengers and crew. And just like the Titanic, our fictional ship can cruise at a top speed of around 23 knots. Now, picture this scenario. The Bright Seaside is cruising at full speed in freezing waters. It's the middle of the night, and the captain doesn't realize that all the iceberg detecting equipment on board isn't functioning. It stopped working 3 days ago. It's very foggy out there, and the lookout also fails to spot a 45-foot-tall iceberg. If that whole situation played out, and the ship smacked into the iceberg head-on, well, it could potentially lead to a sinking. But you can see how unlikely that is, right? That's why experts are quite confident in saying that ice isn't likely to sink modern cruise ships. It's also worth mentioning that safety measures have improved a lot since Titanic. A modern large vessel can take days to sink, which provides enough time to keep everyone safe. Crews are definitely better prepared to handle evacuation procedures, and passengers should also go through safety training before cruising. I know, it is annoying to do that when all you want to do is drink a lemonade or some other beverage by the pool. But, all these safety tips are what saved the MS Explorer from becoming a modern Titanic. You see, back in 2007, all 154 people on board this Antarctic cruise ship managed to get into lifeboats after the ship hit an iceberg. Now imagine their panic as they waited for help for 4 hours. The crew did an excellent job in keeping everybody safe, no doubt. But a report that came out 2 years later said that the MS Explorer accident had happened because of the inexperience of the captain, who had pushed the ship too fast into a wall of ice in the freezing waters of Antarctica. That means that no matter how much tech a ship's got or how fancy its materials are, if you've got a careless captain and a crew that doesn't know how to handle an iceberg hit, yep, a disaster similar to Titanic could happen again. But hey, you shouldn't stress over it. Trust the professionals and keep in mind the odds. In the last 30 years, the MS Explorer was the only cruise ship that sank thanks to an iceberg, and everyone survived. So kick back and enjoy your sea vacation.
The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" The Titanic strikes the ice. Water starts flooding in. Third-class passengers are locked up. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Panic sets in. Violins are playing. The ship sinks. Well, we all know the story of the movie Titanic like the back of our hand by now. But what if I told you that Hollywood lied to us? To tell the real story of what happened that freezing night in 1912, we need to rewind a bit. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" Yep, that part was true. Just before 11:40 at night, Frederick Fleet noticed something darker than the sea directly ahead. As the ship got closer, he realized it was an iceberg. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship turned sharply. Instead of hitting it head-on, Titanic scraped along the side of the berg, sprinkling ice on the forward deck. If you remember, in the movie, Jack and Rose are having a romantic moment when they feel the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. Everything shakes as if they were in the middle of a light earthquake. Some real-life passengers reported feeling something similar after the impact, but according to Titanic survivor Frank Prentice, it wasn't exactly like that. He said there was no impact as such, and it all felt more like slamming on your car brakes. The ship stopped, and that was that. Some people even slept right through the collision, confirming that there wasn't such an abrupt impact. Mr. Prentice, curious about what had happened, left his cabin and went out to the deck. When he got there, all he could see was a little ice on the surface, not the towering iceberg that Jack and Rose saw. But as we all know by now, the real damage happened below the waterline, where the iceberg had a jagged spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in Titanic's hull. Once the crew realized how severe the damage was, they immediately began sending distress calls to nearby ships, asking for help. At some point in the movie, the radio operator goes to the captain and says there is only one ship nearby, the RMS Carpathia, which later ends up rescuing many passengers. But in real life, there were more ships around. It's believed that the SS Californian was only about 23 miles away. This ship might have actually seen the Titanic sinking, or at the very least, seen its rockets exploding high in the sky. Yet, for reasons we will never fully understand, they didn't try to help. Let's get back to the story. Now, people need to get off the ship. At 12:45, lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered. Just like in the movie, women and children were told to go first. But in reality, some women were hesitant and even refused to get into the lifeboats. Mr. Prentice said this happened mainly for 2 reasons. First, these lifeboats were high and passengers were terrified of the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. And second, most women didn't believe the Titanic would actually sink. It was called unsinkable after all. So the idea of getting into a lifeboat seemed pointless at the time. This mindset probably explains why Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger, recalled that there was no panic or chaos at first. Other survivors backed this up, saying that no women or kids were crying. But one thing that was indeed concerning, at least for the crew, was the possibility that the lifeboats might buckle under too much weight. This is one of the theories why the first few lifeboats left carrying only a fraction of their full capacity. Like lifeboat number 7, which only carried 27 people in it, even though it could hold up to 65. In total, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the 2,200 people on board that night. But that didn't happen. And now we know the passengers had no idea there weren't enough for everyone. As women were calmly getting into the first lifeboats, musicians headed up to the deck. Their only goal was to play and keep the passengers calm. That's a pretty well-known fact. But the real story is that some survivors said they never saw or heard the band. No violinists whatsoever. It's not like Hollywood misled you, though. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship had hit the iceberg. So maybe these passengers were just too panicked to notice the songs, or the musicians started playing later than we think. Now, it's time to talk about the terrible treatment that third-class passengers received. The movie portrayed the crew as cruel, locking the less fortunate below deck like animals, giving them no chance to reach the lifeboats and save their lives. But the official inquiry into the disaster suggested that wasn't true. I mean, yes, fewer third-class passengers survived compared to those in first and second class, but there were other factors at play. Many third-class passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, clinging to their belongings, and had a harder time making their way up from the cabins, which were at extreme ends of the ship. Some survivors confirmed that they were not locked up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mrs. George Wabi, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, said that when chaos had erupted, some brave crew members and well-dressed first-class passengers had actually helped her get up to the first-class deck and eventually onto a lifeboat. At first, the Titanic was sinking slowly, bit by bit. Passengers reported seeing the water rising and hearing pops and cracks. Then, there was a loud boom. Some said there had been just one explosion, while others described it as a series of smaller explosions, which they'd thought had been the bulkheads giving way. And there's also a group of people who said they had only heard a rumbling sound. So not everyone agreed on the sound they had heard, but one thing is a fact. By 2:18 in the morning, the lights on Titanic went out, and the ship plunged into complete darkness. As the bow continued sinking, the stern rose out of the water, putting immense pressure on the middle of the ship. This caused the Titanic to break in two. In James Cameron's movie, this moment is pretty dramatic, with the ship sinking almost straight down into the water. But in reality, the break probably happened at a much lower angle, likely just below the waterline. Even so, it tilted enough that people couldn't stay on their feet and started sliding into the water. One interesting thing is that it wasn't until the wreckage was found in 1985 that it was finally confirmed the Titanic had broken apart. Up until then, survivors had given conflicting stories. At least 8 survivors claimed they had seen the ship split. Emily Ryerson, a first-class passenger, described it as if the Titanic had been sliced in half with a knife. But there was also a small number of witnesses that insisted Titanic had gone down intact. At the time, this theory was more accepted because most people still didn't believe that the supposedly indestructible ship could break in half. So why the conflicting reports? Okay, so what you don't see in the movies, for obvious reasons, is how incredibly dark it was when the tragedy happened. It was like being in a room with no light, where you can only make out shapes and shadows. That's what it was like on the lifeboats. This means passengers couldn't really see what was happening, and most of those who were close to the ship either lost their lives or were too focused on trying to survive to pay attention to the details of the wreck. Although James Cameron's film didn't fully capture how terrifyingly dark the disaster truly was, the 2012 TV series Titanic did a better job of showing the pitch-black horror of that night. Even then, the reality was much darker and more terrifying than either of these two productions could portray. In 1998, a diver picked up a strange sonar blip next to the wreck of the Titanic. This blip bugged scientists for over 20 years. The sonar system was clearly showing some huge object was hiding next to the most famous shipwreck in history. The scientists couldn't decide if it was coming from another shipwreck, some sort of a geological feature, or something else they didn't even expect to find there. The mystery was finally solved only in 2022. Paul Henry Nargeolet, the diver who first discovered the blip, teamed up with other researchers and went on a new expedition. They found a whole deep-sea reef made up of various volcanic formations and packed with marine life 9,514 feet under the surface. It turned out the reef was the source of the mysterious blip the sonar had detected. They found sponges, corals, fish, lobsters, and other creatures on top of the basalt ridge. The team made a lot of pictures, videos, and took water samples to study later. They're using computer models to figure out how all the animals and plants found there survive in the deep sea. This can help scientists solve the old mystery of how sponges and corals can spread out across the ocean. These creatures need something solid to hold on to as they grow and multiply. But they also survive in muddy places where it's hard to find these solid surfaces. And it's important for scientists to understand what helps them do it. All of this research is part of a bigger project to see how fragile underwater worlds might change or survive in the future. There's another mystery near the Titanic that Nargeolet wants to explore in the future. He noticed another blip between the Titanic and a newly discovered reef a long time ago. Nargeolet thinks this new mystery object might be even bigger than the reef. The Titanic is lying on the ocean floor in two big pieces pointing in different directions. After it had sunk, the boilers, which show where it went down, were found about 600 feet east of the back end of the ship. The bow of the Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Some people who survived the famous shipwreck mentioned that they had seen the ship break in half as it was sinking. At first, no one believed them. But now we know that the Titanic really did split apart between its second and third funnels as it was going down into the water. It took the most famous ship in history 2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, the damaged compartments were spilling water into others. Water started flooding through anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went under the water and the stern went up at a steep angle of almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing around 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. During the descent, the big funnels were torn off, dragging along cables and other parts of the ship's deck. The ship's front mast also broke and fell, smashing onto the bridge area. The wheelhouse where the captain steered the ship was probably destroyed when the mast came crashing down. The bow was cruising down at about 23 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost half an hour before the stern. The hit was so hard that it bent and broke parts of the ship even more. The decks at the back of the bow collapsed on top of each other. The area around the bridge where the ship was controlled looks especially damaged, almost like a giant fist had squashed it. The roof and sides of the officers' quarters and the gym were pushed in, and railings were bent outwards. Some experts think that when the bow suddenly stopped sinking, a powerful blast of water caused by the sudden halt smashed down onto the wreck. It caused even more damage, but you can't see the damage from when the Titanic hit the iceberg anymore because it's buried under the mud. If you want to go check it out yourself, you must know that the waters around the Titanic are still really, really dangerous. First off, the icebergs are still wild in the area. In 2019, a total of 1,515 icebergs floated far enough south to get into the paths where ships travel across the Atlantic Ocean between March and August. Second, sunlight can only reach about 3,300 feet below the surface, and beyond that, it's completely dark. The area where the Titanic lies is called the Midnight Zone because there's no light at all. When scientists go down to explore the Titanic, they spend over 2 hours descending through pitch-black water before the ocean floor suddenly appears under the lights of their submersible. Seeing anything down there is tough because the submersible's lights only light up a few feet ahead, so it's easy to get lost. To help find their way, explorers use detailed maps of the Titanic wrecksite, built over many years, and special tools like accelerometers and gyroscopes to track the ship's position and orientation. Even with all this technology, it's still really hard to find your way down there. Plus, the deeper you go in the ocean, the more pressure there is from the water all around. At the bottom of the ocean where the Titanic rests, the pressure is about 390 times higher than what we feel at the surface. Because of this, subs need to have really thick walls to survive these extreme conditions and keep the people inside safe. The currents down there aren't as powerful as on the surface, but sometimes so-called benthic storms can create powerful underwater currents that can sweep things away from the ocean floor. The Titanic is affected by them. The currents near it mostly flow from east to west and from northwest to southwest, but they can change direction a lot, especially around the bow section of the wreck. Many experts think that over time, these currents will move enough sand and mud to cover the Titanic wreck with layers of sediment. After more than 100 years underwater, the Titanic slowly started to break down. Tiny microbes have been eating away the metal over the years. This created rusty icicle-like formations called rusticles. These rusticles are making the ship fall apart even faster, especially on the back part. Scientists believe this wreck is breaking down 40 years faster than the front. The wreck is slowly collapsing bit by bit every year, but as long as no one touches or goes inside it, it should stay mostly intact for now. And finally, scientists have found evidence that huge landslides happened around the Titanic wreck long ago. These landslides sent tons of sediment sliding down from the nearby continental slope. They think the last big landslide like this happened tens of thousands of years ago and left layers of sediment up to 328 feet thick. But don't worry, these events are super rare.
Now, it's been barely a century since the Titanic sank, but scientists say that already, within just a few decades, its wreckage could disappear almost entirely. Meanwhile, a Greek wooden shipwreck that's around 2,400 years old is still looking good. Is it because of some ancient shipbuilding magic, the materials, or something entirely different? Well, let's find out. In the red corner, the infamous Titanic really doesn't need an introduction. It was the largest ship of its time, stretching nearly 900 feet in length. Constructed using strong steel plates and held together with iron and steel rivets, it was powered by coal-fired steam engines. Inside were dining rooms, elevators, even a swimming pool. In 1912, Titanic set out from Southampton, heading for New York, with about 2,200 people on board. 4 days later, it hit an iceberg. The hull tore open, water rushed in, and the unsinkable ship went to the bottom of the North Atlantic, nearly 2.5 miles down. When explorers finally found it in 1985, it looked surprisingly complete, with 2 large pieces mostly intact. But time, pressure, and salt water have been eating away at it ever since. Parts like railings have fallen apart, decks have sunk, and entire sections are starting to break down. At this rate, experts believe that by around 2037, most of what's left could be gone. Meanwhile, in the blue corner is the Greek Challenger. In 2018, researchers exploring the Black Sea made a very different kind of discovery. About 6,600 feet below the surface, they found a Greek merchant ship that sank around 400 BCE. Now, it's only about 75 feet long, but it's still clearly recognizable as a ship. The mast and rudder are visible. It was most likely a cargo ship, built for short and medium-range trips, transporting goods between ports rather than across open oceans. Whatever happened, it sank deep in the Black Sea and stayed there, surprisingly well preserved. The wood hasn't disintegrated, and the shape of the ship is still easy to recognize even after so much time. This doesn't seem possible, but the explanation is really cool. In almost every situation, wood is far less resilient than steel. Steel is one of the strongest materials humans have ever made. It can handle huge pressure and heavy loads for years. That's why modern ships, skyscrapers, and bridges are built from it. Wood is soft, flexible, and much weaker. It deteriorates rather quickly, especially when exposed to sunlight, oxygen, and water. Wooden shipwrecks are doomed to disintegrate sooner or later. Salt water soaks in, fibers break down, and living things start to eat it. In shallower warm seas, wood becomes a meal for shipworms. Well, not actual worms, but mollusks that drill through timber like underwater termites. They feed on wooden ships, and in just a couple of decades, poof, gone. So, by all logic, the Titanic, made of solid steel, should be the one lasting longer, and the Greek ship, made of wood, should have turned to dust centuries ago. But that's only true when both are exposed to a similar environment. Titanic's remains are in the North Atlantic. It's one of the harshest environments on Earth. The wreck lies about 12,500 feet deep, where the pressure is more than 370 times greater than at the surface. Temperatures hover just above freezing, and the water is loaded with salt and dissolved oxygen. When iron and steel meet oxygen and salt water, they form iron oxide, or rust. But the Titanic's decay isn't just chemical, it's also biological. In the 1990s, scientists discovered special bacteria on the wreck called Halomonas titanicae. These microbes actually feed on the metal itself, building fragile, icicle-shaped formations called rusticles. Rusticles may look solid, but they're brittle and hollow, like coral made of rust. As they grow, they break off, taking bits of the ship with them. Every rusticle that falls means a little more of the Titanic disappears. Add to that strong underwater currents and deep-sea pressure, and it's easy to understand why the wreck is slowly collapsing in on itself. The Black Sea, on the other hand, has some fascinating traits that make it unique. Its structure is like a giant layer cake, made of two completely different oceans stacked on top of each other. At the top, you have regular seawater, full of oxygen and marine life. But below about 600 feet, it's quite the opposite. The deeper layer is dense, salty, and completely cut off from the surface. Scientists call this stratification, meaning the layers don't mix much, kind of like oil and vinegar after they've settled in a bottle. That happens because rivers on one side bring in a lot of fresh water, while salty water from the Mediterranean sneaks in through a narrow passage near Turkey. The fresh water floats on top because it's lighter, trapping the heavier, saltier layer underneath. Now here's the cool part. That lower layer has been sealed off for thousands of years. No oxygen reaches it, so oxygen-dependent marine life can't survive. Instead, it's filled with hydrogen sulfide, a gas produced by bacteria that live off decaying organic matter. In other words, the environment helps preserve materials by preventing typical biological decay. Without oxygen and living creatures to feed on wood or metal, whatever sinks there basically ends up frozen in time for quite a while. And it really works. Even delicate things like rope, leather, and fabric have survived at those depths. That's why archaeologists love this place. They've recorded over 60 shipwrecks, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman, many of them remarkably well preserved. Ancient shipbuilders were true artists. They didn't have machines or metal welding, but they knew how to make wood strong enough to survive storms and long voyages. By the 5th century BCE, Greek builders had developed ships capable of traveling on long-distance Mediterranean trade routes. Their design stayed mostly the same for centuries. You could say they were the trucks of the ancient world, just slower. Over time, humans kept improving their ships. By the Middle Ages, sailing vessels had multiple masts and complex rigging, allowing them to cross the oceans instead of just hugging the coast. Then came the Age of Exploration, massive wooden ships with cannons, global trade, and sea empires. By the 19th century, wood had reached its limits. Steam engines replaced sails, and iron and steel replaced timber. Ships got bigger, faster, and stronger. When the Titanic was built in 1912, it represented the absolute peak of shipbuilding technology. It even had electricity. Even if the Titanic hadn't sunk, it wouldn't be sailing today anyway. Maybe it'd be a floating museum. One thing is certain though, it would have been a vastly different movie. Today, scientists are racing to preserve both kinds of shipwrecks, the ones frozen in time and the ones fading fast. In the North Atlantic, robotic submarines are mapping the Titanic with 3D scans before the wreck collapses completely. Meanwhile, in the Black Sea, underwater drones explore without disturbing anything, capturing ships that look almost new, complete with anchors, pottery, and carved decorations. Because the seabed there has been closed off since forever, it's not just ships that survive. Ancient pots, tools, and even traces of villages still lie buried in the dark, undisturbed layers of silt. It's one place you need on your map if you are into sea archaeology. But not all shipwrecks are left untouched. Around the world, an increasingly common approach is turning select historic wrecks into managed underwater museums. Instead of keeping them out of reach, scientists and conservationists are inviting divers to explore them responsibly. For example, off the coast of Greece, one ancient shipwreck from the classical era now serves as a protected dive site. In most cases, moving sunken boats is impractical and risks damage. They're safer underwater until some new technology arrives. Maybe we're not that far from the future where commercially available submarines could allow everyone to see the great Titanic firsthand. That's highly unlikely, of course. But in case of a what-if scenario, we just have to hope it happens while the ship is still there.
Meet Arthur John Priest. No, he isn't famous for being a painter or for discovering some long-lost treasure. He didn't invent some cool gadget or break any world records. No, Arthur John Priest is famous simply for being unsinkable. Proving one can be both lucky and unlucky at the same time, Priest was involved in, and survived, several mishaps at sea, including the fateful maiden voyage of the Titanic. Priest was not a rich man interested in sailing for pleasure. He was part of the working class, employed as a stoker or fireman, stuck for hours within the hot bowels of large steam-powered vessels. His job was dirty and difficult. He was responsible for keeping the furnaces lit, feeding them coal to ensure enough steam was produced for the engines to work. He had to be careful about not overheating the system or setting fire to the whole ship. The furnaces had to be carefully watched and constantly fed. He breathed it all in a while, working and fighting with the sweat and the dirt. He would often work shirtless because of the heat and was always covered in black coal dust. And when he finally had a break, his shared living quarters were nearby in the same part of the ship. He must have been good at his job though, because he had no trouble finding work. But wherever he went, bad luck seemed to follow. The first incident was a mild one. As a young man, Priest worked on the RMS Asturias. The passenger liner first set sail in 1907, traveling between Southampton in the UK to Buenos Aires in Argentina. At some point during its maiden voyage, the ship suffered a small collision. The damage was bad enough that the ship returned for repairs. Thankfully, there were no reports of any serious injuries. Priest, unfazed, simply went to work on another ship, but his bad luck lingered on the Asturias. In 1914, the Asturias became a hospital ship, helping care for sick men and women around Europe while bringing them home to England. But in March 1917, at just around midnight, the ship was struck by a foreign object. Its hull was breached and the engine room flooded. The captain ordered everyone to abandon the ship, sending crew, patients, and health staff scrambling for the lifeboats. The vessel was still moving, powering through the water because the main controls, located within the flooded engine room, could not be turned off. The captain refused to leave the ship while people were still trying to escape. He was able to aim the Asturias towards Bolt Head, where it finally hit land and couldn't sink. The remaining lifeboats were lowered and the final survivors made it to safety. When they studied the damage on the ship later, the Asturias was declared a total write-off. It might be hard to pin this particular disaster on Priest. After all, he wasn't even on the ship at the time. But it seemed that many of the ships on which he served were destined for trouble. His bad luck followed him to his next job on the RMS Olympic, a massive ocean liner. The Olympic was big. In fact, it had been designed and built as part of the fleet that included the Titanic. But with size came sacrifice. The Olympic was great at moving in one direction, but very difficult to handle when it needed to turn. It was September 1911. The Olympic was trying to alter its course. The Hawk, a smaller ship sailing nearby, didn't give the larger vessel enough room to maneuver, and the two slammed into each other. Because the Hawk was engineered to deal with potential confrontations when out at sea, its reinforced bow tore through the Olympic. Two large gashes appeared on the ocean liner's side. The propeller shaft was badly twisted, and worse, the ship began to take on water. Somehow, the Olympic made it to shore without sinking, and nobody was seriously hurt. Priest had no idea that this was just a small taste of what his future held for him. He next found employment on a brand new ship, a better ship, an unsinkable marvel that was said to be the biggest vessel to have ever been built. Yes, he was going to work on the Titanic. And what a job! It took 29 boilers, requiring 850 tons of coal a day to produce enough steam to power the Titanic. Priest was just one of 150 stokers toiling away in the ship's underbelly, keeping those fires burning day and night. He made around $30 a month. But on April 14, 1912, he would find himself flung from a world of extreme heat to one of blistering cold. At approximately 11:35 p.m., the crew spotted an iceberg. The Titanic tried to avoid it, but the alarm had been sounded too late. 5 minutes later, the two collided. The iceberg tore through the hull, and the once watertight compartments inside were badly ruptured. As the cold Atlantic water flooded in, the ship began to sink. Distress signals were sent, but the closest ship, the Carpathia, was over 3 hours away. In the dark of night and stuck in the middle of nowhere, the crew and passengers panicked. Those who could scrambled for the lifeboats. Others jumped into the icy waters. In total, only 706 survived that terrible night. Priest, at the time of the collision, was down in the ship's lower quarters. He was on break, relaxing from a hard day of work. And as the ship went down, so did his chances of survival. He and his fellow workers were in the most dangerous position on the ship. They had to make their way through a maze of corridors and gangways, some of which were flooded, in a mad dash to the deck. And then they faced the frigid water, jumping in and desperately swimming to safety. The ocean was so cold that Priest even suffered frostbite before finding his way onto a lifeboat. He was one of only 44 stokers to survive that night. After an experience like that, most of us would never set foot on a boat again. But Priest had to work. His next job also ended in disaster. He was offered employment on the HMS Alcantara. It went down in 1916, and Priest was again one of the few to make it to safety. He was badly wounded in the process. But he kept pressing his luck, and his next job as a stoker may have felt eerily familiar. He would be working on a ship built by the same people behind both the Olympic and the Titanic. And this ship, named the Britannic, was the biggest of the three. It was also believed to be a superior vessel, fitted with new safety features after the Titanic sank. For example, it had 48 open lifeboats, 46 of which were the largest ever used on a ship before. 2 of these were even motorized, and equipped with special communication devices. The good news? The Britannic survived its first trip without incident. It was already doing better than the Titanic ever did. However, on November 21st, 1916, the Britannic was shaken by a loud explosion while traveling through the key channel in the Aegean Sea. The hull was damaged, and some of the compartments began to fill with water. But, unlike the Titanic, the Britannic had been designed for just such an emergency. It had been fitted with 5 watertight bulkheads. Intact, these would help keep the ship safe and floating for a much longer period of time. But there was one issue. Portholes along the lower decks had foolishly been left open. As the ship tilted, the portholes let in water, which flooded the Britannic and hastened its descent into the sea. This effectively made those watertight bulkheads useless. The ship was going down fast, much faster, in fact, than the Titanic had sunk. 35 of the lifeboats were successfully launched, saving most on board. Of the 1,066 passengers and crew, 1,036 survived. Priest, his luck intact, was one of them. And yet, he still wasn't done with a life at sea. He accepted a position as a stoker on the Donegal. It was a smaller passenger ferry that had been converted for use as a hospital boat. In April 1917, it was struck by a foreign object while fleeing an unsafe situation, and though he suffered from a head injury, Priest was again one of the survivors. It took experiencing 2 collisions and 4 sinkings before Priest was finally ready to retire. In fact, he reportedly said he only gave it up because no one wanted to sail with him. Can you blame them? He would live out the rest of his life on dry land in Southampton, England, with his wife Annie and their 3 sons. But Arthur John Priest would always be remembered as the unsinkable stoker. Can you guess how many theories of the Titanic's sinking exist? Right, loads, including a theory of my own, which I'm going to share with you today. And then you can decide which one seems most likely to you. One Piece theory. The very first version of the events was the One Piece theory. It's very simple and basically claims that the sinking happened without any breakups. 2:15 a.m., the ship collides with an iceberg. 2:18 a.m., the lights go out. The ship reaches an angle of 45 degrees and then quickly begins its final plunge into the ocean depths. 2:20 a.m., only about 3 minutes later, the RMS Titanic disappears under the surface of the ocean for good. The liner doesn't break, it just goes down as a whole piece. Of course, this can't be true. In April 1912, the Titanic was not only the largest ship in the world, but also the largest ship ever built. It's hard to believe that such a heavy vessel could have gone down without breaking. That's just impossible. Well, I mean, you can't blame the theorists. Before we found the wreckage, there were no other theories. Wait a minute, or were there? The day after the disaster, the survivors gave their interviews. They talked about what had happened, and some of them claimed that the ship had actually broken in 2 when it had been flooded. For example, Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old boy, outlined the sinking as he remembered it, and L.D. Skidmon drew a sketch based on his description. The picture clearly showed the ship breaking in half. But no one believed Jack or other witnesses. There was no evidence, so their claims were received with a grain of salt. But in 1985, things changed. First, breakup theory. That's when Robert Ballard found the wreckage of the Titanic in the depths of the ocean. When people saw the wreckage, it became clear that Jack and the other survivors had been right. The Titanic did indeed break in 2 when it sank. So it's time for a new theory. 2:15 a.m. The keel breaks, the starboard list eases, and the hull continues to bow and crumble. 2:17 a.m. The galley sections break off. The towers immediately drop under their own weight. The lights go out. The stern is pulled into the air. The bow breaks off and starts sinking. The aft is barely hanging on to the starboard side of the stern section superstructure. The stern section slowly lists over to port as it begins sinking again. It rises up one last time and pivots in a semicircle as it sinks. It all sounds pretty convincing, right? But people began to find plot holes in this theory. For example, The Titanic couldn't have held together until it reached such a high angle. The breakup would have had to begin much earlier. This only meant there was still a vast field for research and speculations. So people started to come up with their own possible scenarios. How about we look first at the ones no one likes? V-break and Aaron 1912 V-break. According to the first breakup theory, the Titanic reached a high angle, and the weight of its unsupported stern caused it to crack from the top down. But it's physically impossible. So, are there any other ideas? In 2006, Roger Long, a naval architect, decided to research a so-called V theory. 2:17 a.m. The breakup begins at a shallow angle, perhaps as little as 11 degrees. The upper structure fails and starts to crack. At this moment, only its double bottom is holding the Titanic together, but it starts to bend under the strain too, failing the ship. Water is pouring through the crack. It increases the weight in between the two sections, bending the Titanic the other way and pulling it into shape somewhat resemblant to the letter V. The upper decks get mangled and bent together. The bow heads for the bottom, and the stern is the last to sink. This theory has since been disproven many times, though. Roger Long believed it because the broken edges of the upper decks in the Titanic's bow section were all mangled and crushed. However, we have learned that it happened because of the so-called hydraulic downburst, the force of the water crashing into the deck as the Titanic hit the ocean floor. Another V-break theory states that the bow had risen out of the water after the break. This theory was mainly peddled by one former Titanic enthusiast. But not only has this theory been proved to be physically impossible due to the bow's incredible mass, it was also inspired by incorrect information. Remember Jack Thayer? Well, it was based on his sketch and the words of a couple of passengers. But the truth is, none of them had ever seen the Titanic break down like this. Jack himself even stated in an interview that the sketch was completely out of context to what he had actually seen. It was drawn by a passenger on the Carpathia, the ship that received the Titanic's distress signal and came to its aid. It couldn't be used as evidence. Now that we know this, let's move on to the theories that most people believe in. James Cameron's banana peel theory. Who hasn't seen the legendary movie about the Titanic, right? It became the leader of the 70th Academy Awards ceremony in the number of nominations and awards, and deservedly so. But did you know that James Cameron had been interested in the Titanic for many years and studied the ship's history? His books and research are very detailed, and he even came up with his own version of the events. It's called the banana split theory, and this is actually what you could see in the movie. Here's how it goes. The Titanic reaches a 23-degree angle and fractures down to the keel. The double bottom acts as a hinge as the stern falls down. When the double bottom fails, the bow and the stern separate. The stern lists to port, standing vertically, and then begins to go underwater. This theory is the most scientifically accurate one, along with Roy Mengott's theory. Wait, who's Roy Mengott? Mengott theory. Roy Mengott was an engineer who came up with the most plausible theory for the time being. 2:17 a.m. The lights go out on the Titanic. At this moment, the ship is at an angle of 20 to 23 degrees. Suddenly, the vessel snaps in two just around the third funnel. It causes the stern to settle into the water. The keel fails first. The draft and lower hull are crushed and break apart. Water surges into the bow and stern of the ship through the huge cracks, causing the bow section to sink beneath the waves. The stern rises up to the angle of 70 to 90 degrees, and then it sinks too. This theory seems to make the most sense, but it's quite controversial. The survivors who saw the breakup stated that the stern had settled back with the bow completely missing. Mengott's theory, however, contradicts that statement, while James Cameron's scenario takes this into account. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? The truth must be somewhere in the middle. My version. Now, as promised, I'll provide you with my version of the events. Well, it's not really my theory, more like a combination of Roy Mengott's and James Cameron's ones. I believe that James Cameron was right about the breakup. 2:17 a.m. The ship is at a high angle. The lights go out. Then it snaps into two pieces. The bow starts sinking. The double bottom is still attached to the stern for a minute or so. Once the double bottom fails, the two parts separate and the bow goes down. Then, as Mengott said, the stern rises up at a high angle, and then it begins to sink vertically. It might have actually happened because the survivors stated that they had seen a clean break. This means it couldn't be hidden. And they had also seen the stern staying vertically in the air for a long enough time, probably a few minutes, before disappearing. Anyways, all of these are just speculations. Regardless of how the Titanic broke apart and sank, it was a great tragedy. It's already been 110 years since the Titanic collided with an iceberg and sank. Did you know that in 2022, the Blue Star Line Company is completing the construction of an exact replica of the Titanic? Called the Titanic II liner, the ship will be sent sailing along the same route with 2,400 people on board. Let's hope that everything goes well for them. Over a century ago, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Of the 2,240 people on board, only around 700 survived. Since then, the tragedy has been the subject of endless movies, documentaries, and books. And though we've learned a lot about the ship and many of the people on board, we hardly know anything about the iceberg responsible for the catastrophe, especially anything concerning its size. But maybe we can find some clues. The Titanic was constructed by the White Star Line as part of its new fleet of passenger liners. At the time, it was the largest ship ever built, and it lived up to its name. The ship was 883 feet long, equal to 2.5 soccer fields placed end to end, and 175 feet tall, which is close to 10 giraffes standing on top of one another. From the waterline to the deck alone, the boat was 60 feet high. That's close to the height of a 4-story building. The Titanic was big enough to have veranda cafes, a restaurant, a reading and writing room, a Turkish bath, a gym, and squash courts. There was even space for a swimming pool. The liner could carry a total of 3,300 people, including 2,435 passengers and 900 crew members. Although luxury was important, safety was paramount. The Titanic had been designed to have 16 watertight compartments below its deck. If the ship's hull was somehow compromised in an accident, up to 4 of these compartments could take on the water, while the remaining 12 would keep the ship afloat. Philip Franklin, vice president of the White Star Line, said this was what made the ship truly remarkable. It's believed that the man said, "There is no danger the Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers." He was so very wrong. The ship left England for its first and last voyage on April 10, 1912. And all it took was a single iceberg to bring that mighty vessel down. Icebergs are fascinating. They are formed during a process called calving, when large chunks of freshwater ice break free from glaciers and float away into open water. They eventually melt away and disappear. In the northern hemisphere, the majority of these icebergs come from Greenland. In the south, they come from Antarctica. What you see on top of the water is only a small portion of an iceberg. This is just the tip. Most of it, up to 90%, is hidden under the water. Only when you examine pictures of the entire thing can you truly appreciate how massive icebergs are. It's the part of the iceberg you can't see that is often the most dangerous. Beneath the waves, it can have jagged edges in random places. A ship can easily get too close without realizing it, resulting in serious damage to the bottom of the boat. And it's not just big icebergs you have to watch out for. Smaller ones, which are more difficult to spot, can prove to be just as dangerous. A growler, for example, is under 7 feet long, with just a bit more than 3 feet showing above the water. And a slightly larger bergy bit is less than 15 feet in size. The dangers of icebergs were well known when the Titanic set sail. In 1901, The Islander was traveling through the inside passage to Alaska. It collided with an iceberg and sank immediately. Luckily, 138 of the 178 people on board made it to safety. Back then, there wasn't any special equipment for detecting icebergs. The best tool was your eyes. From a special vantage point above the ship called the crow's nest, 2 members of the crew had to stare out over the ocean and watch for potential hazards. The crow's nest was located at the front of the ship, 49 feet above the deck. It was attached to the mast. From this height, a person had a good view of the ocean. If they saw anything suspicious, they could ring a large bell to sound the alarm. After that, they could call from a special telephone to warn the captain of any danger. But imagine what a horrible job this would have been, especially on the night the Titanic sank. The crow's nest wasn't a warm and cozy room surrounded by windows. Instead, it was a large open tub exposed to the elements. On April 14, 1912, the air temperature was around 39 degrees Fahrenheit, which is close to freezing. With the ship moving at about 23 knots, more than 26 miles per hour, the sailors must have felt that frigid cold air pressing against any exposed skin. The only good thing about the job was that the shift only lasted 2 hours. Frederick Fleet was the sailor who actually spotted the iceberg that sank the Titanic. He was up in the crow's nest, working with Reginald Lee at the time. Fleet kept track of the left side of the ship, while Lee scanned the right. It was 10 p.m. when the 2 men started their shift. They had already been warned about the possibility of ice. But when you're cold and it's dark, it might feel like an impossible task. Even worse, the 2 men didn't even have binoculars to make the job any easier. Fleet would later insist that having binoculars would have prevented the tragedy. With about 20 minutes remaining on the job, the sailors noticed the iceberg. Fleet rang the bell, once, twice, and again. He then called up to the bridge to inform the crew. At first, the call seemed to come in the nick of time. The ship's engines reversed, and the massive ocean liner managed to turn. It wasn't enough to miss the iceberg, though. Ice showered down onto the ship's deck. The iceberg tore through the hull, and water flooded in. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the Titanic was gone. And here we have clue number 1. The iceberg was big enough to be spotted with the unaided eye in the dark of the night without any binoculars. It was also tall enough for bits of ice to fall down onto the ship's deck. Since this all took place long before social media and smartphones, nobody on board would have been taking photos or videos at the time. So, of course, we don't have any footage of the actual iceberg. But there are photos of the possible iceberg from later that day. The SS Prinz Adalbert was sailing near the area on the morning of April 15, 1912. The steward on the ship had not yet heard about what had happened to the Titanic. But when he spotted an iceberg floating by, he was compelled to photograph it. Why? There was a line of red paint along the bottom of the iceberg, indicating that it had likely collided with a ship sometime within the previous 12 hours. A second photo was taken from a ship called the Minia, which was sent into the area to look for debris from the collision. Captain de Carteret said that among the wreckage, he had seen only one iceberg. He also noticed a streak of red paint on it. From the photos and witness accounts, newspaper reports estimated the iceberg to be 50 to 100 feet high and 200 to 400 feet long. That's clue number 2. The iceberg that hit the Titanic probably started its ocean journey from Greenland's coast, heading past the Baffin Bay to the Davis Strait. From here, it must have slipped through the Labrador Sea and finally reached the Atlantic. And that, in itself, is pretty impressive. The glaciers in Greenland create between 15,000 to 30,000 icebergs each year. Some small, some big. Of these, a mere 1% will actually make it to the Atlantic. The others simply melt along the way. We know that the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean, where the sinking took place, was around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's below freezing. For humans, this could cause frostbite or hypothermia. But that temperature is actually warm for an iceberg. Most would only last 2 to 3 years in the North Atlantic, slowly melting into the warmer water. Based on this, It's likely that the Titanic's iceberg left Greenland in 1910 or 1911 and was fully melted by late 1912 or 1913. But since it did make it to the Atlantic and managed to cause significant damage to the ship, we have clue number 3. We will never know for certain the size of the iceberg from that day, but we do know that it definitely wasn't a growler or a bergy bit. Both those types of icebergs are much too small, and if the ice was indeed scattered across the deck during the collision, the iceberg must have been a little taller than 60 feet. The newspaper estimates are probably as close as we're going to get. The iceberg that took down the Titanic was indeed a formidable one, and icebergs are still a threat. As recently as 2007, the cruise ship Explorer struck one and sank in Antarctica's Weddell Sea. Luckily, everybody survived. The International Ice Patrol was created in 1914 following the Titanic's sinking. The organization is still in operation today, made up of representatives from several countries. Using airplanes and radar, the patrol locates and tracks larger icebergs, making the information available to anyone who needs it and preventing more ocean tragedies in the process.
Once a famous giant, the largest ship of that time, now 2 grand pieces lying on the ocean bottom about 2,000 feet apart, torn by the catastrophic collision of time itself. The stern of the Titanic got completely ruined after hitting the ocean floor, but you can still recognize the bow since many interiors were left preserved. There's a type of bacteria found on the ship's rusticles. A rusticle is this brownish formation of rust. It occurs deep underwater when the wrought iron the ship is made of oxidizes. It means the bacteria eat the iron of the Titanic's hull, piece by piece. And it seems they might finish their snack by 2030, way sooner than when anyone would expect the wreck to be gone forever. You may think it would probably be easier to take the wreck out of the water so that we got to keep it, but it would fall apart if anyone tried to do that. It's been in the water for more than 110 years now, and is now so rusty that no one would be able to reconstruct some parts even if we managed to get the ship out of the ocean depths. What do you think? Could any of about 700 people that had survived the sinking of the Titanic hear it hit the ocean bottom? The largest ship that had ever been made till then disappeared literally before their eyes after all. But sound most likely wouldn't have traveled from water to air. We can't hear that well in water because our bodies are not designed to hear in such environments. And although passengers were close to the sinking site, the Titanic still hit the bottom a long distance away, 12,500 feet. There are so many underwater landslides and earthquakes we cannot hear, and they make way more noise than a single ship slamming into the ocean floor. Most vibrations and sounds must have dispersed over a large area. Also, the downblast of water, which many believe hit the Titanic after it had touched the bottom of the ocean, would have pushed back the majority of the potential acoustic vibrations. Plus, the bottom of the ocean is not hard enough to produce such loud noises. Many survivors said they had heard terrifying noises as the Titanic was breaking apart, but none mentioned hearing anything after the ship disappeared below the surface of the water. Some survivors shared how chaotic it was when passengers, mainly women and children, were getting into lifeboats. There weren't enough boats, and still, some of them weren't even filled to their full capacity. No one knew how to react properly in such a situation. The lifeboat drill had been scheduled for the morning before the Titanic hit the iceberg, but for some reason, it got canceled. A giant ocean liner everyone believes is unsinkable takes a trip across the ocean. On its way, it strikes an iceberg and sinks. Yeah, we all know how the story goes. But what's scary is that it's also the plot of The Wreck of the Titan, a novel published in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic went to the ocean bottom or was even constructed. In the novel, the Titan, what a scarily accurate name too, didn't have enough life jackets, vests, and lifeboats for all the passengers on board. It was also the largest ship of that time, almost identical in size to the Titanic, and both the Titan and Titanic sank in April.
Dorothy Gibson was an American silent film actress. She was also one of the Titanic passengers. She survived the catastrophe. Right after she came to New York, she started filming Saved from the Titanic. The film was released only 1 month after the ship sank. Dorothy was even wearing the same shoes and clothes she had worn when she had actually been on the ship. The movie was successful, but it got destroyed in a fire, so it only exists in memories, like Jack Dawson. Titanic wasn't all alone in the restless waves of the cold ocean near the iceberg it struck. The SS Californian was relatively close. Their radio was shut off for that night though. At one moment, the crew members noticed mysterious lights in the sky. They immediately went to wake their captain up to tell him, but he issued no orders. Some believed it was just fireworks. They never realized it was actually a call for help. The flares crew members of the Titanic sent off to the sky, hoping someone would notice. By the time the SS Californian got the SOS message, it was already too late. Some say a full moon may have been the reason the iceberg crossed paths with the gigantic ship. A full moon may have caused incredibly strong tides that eventually sent multiple icebergs southward, right when the Titanic was crossing that area. Would you dare to taste cheese from the Titanic? The wreck has been under the ocean surface for more than 100 years now. It took more than 70 years to find it. By that time, most of the food that had gone down together with the ship had, of course, spoiled. But it's possible there's still some of it left. Some foods are protected from decay. For example, cheese. The microbes that turn milk into cheese create special conditions to protect the product from spoiling. Multiple things have survived the Titanic. A handwritten letter where a mother and a daughter wrote to the girl's grandma about the amazing journey they were on together. The letter has been around for more than 100 years and got sold at an auction. A battered pair of white cotton gloves was found in the wreck. Musicians on the Titanic played till the very last moment. Sheet music and one violin were found among the wreckage. The bell one of the crew members rang 3 times to warn there was a very close iceberg on their way. A pocket watch that stopped at 1:45 a.m., the time when the ship went under the water. Perhaps one person could have changed what happened on the Titanic. David Blair was a pretty lucky man. He was supposed to take the spot of the second officer of the Titanic. He was pulled out at the last moment, which eventually saved his life. It was a great thing for him, but something clouded his joy. What if he was the only person who could have done something to save the ship and the passengers? Back in the day, ships didn't have smart advanced technology like they do today. They couldn't see a threat on the horizon. Binoculars were pretty helpful, but the crew members on the Titanic didn't have access to the room where they were kept. David Blair was the man responsible for the keys. He left the ship in a hurry and forgot to hand over the keys that were in his pocket. Maybe if the crew members had had access to the binoculars, they would have seen the iceberg on time and had enough time to change course. It's possible that the giant iceberg that sent the Titanic to the ocean bottom was made of snow that had fallen in southwest Greenland. Scientists even used a computer model to calculate the paths the iceberg took in any given year, taking into consideration ocean currents and weather readings for that year. It's possible that the iceberg was 1,700 feet long, with a weight of around 75 tons. By the time it collided with the Titanic, it had dwindled down to only 1.5 tons. Violet Constance Jessup was, as many called her, Miss Unsinkable. She was only 24 years old when she joined the Titanic crew as a stewardess. On the tragic night when the ship struck the iceberg, she was lying in bed. As soon as she heard that something was going on, she got dressed and quickly went to the deck. Violet helped passengers get into lifeboats. 4 years later, she was on the Britannic, the Titanic's sister ship. Once again, the ship started sinking. Not only did the woman survive another accident, but she was also once again the one helping other people to escape the vessel before it disappeared below the surface.
No one could ever have imagined that the unsinkable Titanic would collide with an iceberg, except for one man, William Thomas Stead. Well, not directly, of course. It's not like he jolted out of bed one day, envisioning the fall of the Titanic. Rather, he wrote an empowering short story called How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor on March 3, 1886, 26 years before Titanic sank. Okay, let's do a super quick recap. Titanic was traveling from Southampton to New York in April 1912 in the North Atlantic. The ship hit an iceberg, and less than 3 hours later, it was completely underwater. Out of 2,208 people on board, just 706 survived due to the limited number of lifeboats and icy cold water. Another passenger ship, Carpathia, heard the distress call, picked up the survivors, and brought them safely to New York. The short story William Stead wrote was about Thomas, a British sailor, who got on a passenger liner bound for the U.S. At one point, the protagonist realized there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board the ship in case something happened. A couple of days later, heavy fog covered everything in sight. Luck was not on the liner's side, and it collided with a stray ship, just like Titanic struck an iceberg. Only 200 out of the 916 people made it safely to the U.S. The main character managed to survive by jumping into the water and climbing into one of the lifeboats. Now, you'd think that the story riled up everyone in the industry to add extra lifeboats on ships. But sadly, it received very little attention when it was published. Even more tragically, William Thomas Stead was on Titanic when it sank, and he didn't make it. The survivors who knew Stead mentioned that he had always been cheerful and had loved to chat during meals. He complimented the ship's design and how sturdy it was. Witnesses also talked about how he had been helpful when the ship had been sinking, having given his life jacket to someone else. He was a journalist by profession and was on his way to New York for a ceremony. One of his most important contributions to modern journalism was the use of illustrations in every newspaper article. He also introduced newspaper interviews, and they're still used to this day along with illustrations. But this story wasn't the only published work that predicted the disaster. Morgan Robertson was an author and former ship captain who wrote short stories and novels. His most notable novella is The Wreck of the Titan. It's also known as Futility. The book was written in 1898, 14 years before Titanic. It was a fictional story about the Titan, an ocean liner similar to Titanic, which was crossing the North Atlantic. It's also a coincidence that Titan was just as fast as Titanic and shared many other similarities, like size and design. The book described it as unsinkable and the largest ship to hit the ocean at the time. That's what they said about Titanic, too. Another eerie similarity was the limited number of lifeboats it had. The story took place in April, and that's when Titanic set off on its journey and hit the iceberg. The Titan story also mentioned that barely anyone had survived that horrible accident. Unlike Stead's story, the protagonist of Robertson took a different path. The Titan sinking happened somewhere halfway through the book, so after the accident, the main character went on with his life. The book was brought back into the spotlight after the Titanic disaster. How could someone describe the events that took place almost a decade later so accurately? Many started to believe Robertson could see the future. But the reality was that Robertson knew his way around a ship. It was easy for him to write down the nitty-gritty of things without doing more research. Realistically, one of the biggest threats for ships at that time was hitting an iceberg or colliding with other ships. The next story sounds somewhat mysterious. Once, Alex Mackenzie heard a voice that warned him not to board Titanic. But when he turned around, there was nobody there. As he continued walking, the voice spoke to him again, but this time it was louder and more distinct. He took the warning seriously and decided to cancel the trip and go back to Glasgow, Scotland, his hometown. His grandparents weren't too happy to find him back home instead of on Titanic. After all, the ticket was very expensive. That disappointment very soon disappeared when they heard that the ship had struck an iceberg. John Coffey was a member of the crew of Titanic, but he decided to ditch the ride when the ship stopped at his hometown in Queenstown, Ireland. His inner voice told him to get off the liner, and he did. He was only 23 at the time, and for someone his age, It could be a major career boost and an opportunity to grow. Despite the horrible tragedy, the guy signed to work with the RMS Mauritania just months after the Titanic sinking. Talk about commitment. Some added info was revealed about what may have contributed to the fall of Titanic. The constructors insisted that the ship was unsinkable, but many people later theorized that the vessel's steel plates had been too frail for the freezing Atlantic water. It may have caused the rivets to pop, allowing ocean water to seep inside. Another theory is that there may have been a fire in the hull of the Titanic that had been raging for 3 weeks before the voyage. The fire softened the steel, allowing the iceberg to cut through it like a hot knife through butter. Some pictures before the ship set off on its journey show black marks on the hull, which could have been caused by fire. Either way, the iceberg would have caused significant damage in any case, no matter if there was a fire or not. Some people also blame those who designed the Titanic. The ship was built with large joints at the bottom, which probably snapped easily during the collision. Of course, these are all theories, but we know for a fact that the iceberg was the main character of this drama, and that the works of Stead and Robertson should have been taken seriously. Either way, this should be a lesson for the future, helping to prevent similar tragic accidents. By the way, ocean liners and passenger ships wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Thomas Newcomen. In 1712, he invented a steam engine that was so strong it could produce enough energy to power a ship. And a century later, in 1819, the first steamship traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to Liverpool, UK. It only took the vessel 29 days to cross the ocean. The passenger ship industry boomed in the early 1900s when it became easier for people to move to America or go on holidays. As decades rolled by, the use of aircraft stole the spotlight from passenger ships since planes were faster and more efficient. Nowadays, it's quite rare for a passenger ship to collide with anything in open water. Modern technologies can detect anything that can pose a threat and even predict stormy weather. Cruise ships these days are giants compared to the vessels of Titanic's era. Modern ships can carry almost twice the number of passengers and have amenities folks back then could only dream of. Most cruise ships these days have several restaurants to choose from, multiple swimming pools, and game rooms to catch a break. If you're in the mood for some fun, you can watch live performances. Don't forget about the helicopter pad, because why not? Don't worry if you start feeling unwell. The in-house doctors are always there to help any passenger in need. And these ships are only going to get bigger. Putting Titanic and a modern cruise ship side by side is like comparing a Corgi to a Doberman. Back then, Titanic was the biggest and most cutting-edge vessel anyone could dream of. So, who knows what the future of cruise ships can hold? We might even have entire cities floating around. That would be a really big boat.
There were no binoculars on board the famous Titanic on the night when they were needed the most. The lookouts were blind, helpless, and doomed, and the ship went down, taking hundreds of lives, right? Well, it's just one of the many myths from a whole ocean of half-truths, rumors, and dramatic retellings the Titanic is still sailing in. There were binoculars on board. The real issue was access. The binoculars were locked in a cabinet in the crow's nest, which is the lookout point, but the key went missing. A crew member named David Blair, who was supposed to be on the Titanic, was reassigned to a different ship at the last minute. He forgot to leave the key behind. The key to saving hundreds of lives, literally, was sitting in his pocket far away as the Titanic was going down. But we'll never find out what would have happened if the key had been there. The sky was clear that night, but there wasn't a moon to light the way, and there was no wind, so the sea was glassy, and there were no ripples, which are the usual warning signs of icebergs floating around. Then there's the idea that the Titanic was racing across the Atlantic to break a speed record, but historians disagree. The Titanic's crew knew there was ice out there, but instead of slowing down, they just kept going, cruising around 22 knots. That's only a couple of knots slower than her top speed, but the Titanic wasn't being pushed to her limits. Many of her furnaces weren't even fully stoked.
And it was normal practice for that time to just keep going and trust those on the lookout to spot the ice before the ship hits it. Those massive Atlantic liners weren't about taking it easy. They were about being perfectly on time. Ships like the Titanic were basically the express trains of the sea, and any delay would have been a PR disaster. So, yeah, they knew the risks, but didn't think it was a big deal. After all, plenty of ships had close calls before and came out okay. They didn't see ice as a huge threat those days, and weren't even afraid of head-on collisions. And have you heard that the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, marketed it as unsinkable? In 1910, the company was hyping up their two new ocean giants, the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic. Their ads proudly declared these ships were designed to be unsinkable. What the company meant by it was that, on paper, the design should keep them afloat. Later on, they even had to clarify that they never promised the ships were actually unsinkable. By 1911, before the Titanic even hit the water, magazines were already running wild with the idea. Writers were calling her practically unsinkable, pointing to her fancy new watertight compartments as proof. And just like that, a legend was born before the ship even left the dock. After she went down, even one of White Star Line's own executives admitted during the official inquiry that when he first heard the news, he didn't believe it. He genuinely believed the Titanic couldn't sink. But that whole unsinkable thing was never the main selling point. White Star Line wasn't really pushing safety, but selling luxury. The Titanic was supposed to be the crown jewel of ocean travel, massive, elegant, and dripping in comfort. Another story that just stuck with us is that before the iceberg even struck, a coal fire was burning away in one of the Titanic's bunkers. It weakened the ship's hull and made it more vulnerable. Some people even say that fire caused or accelerated the sinking. Well, it's partially true. There was a coal fire in one of the Titanic's coal bunkers before the voyage. Fires in coal bunkers weren't unusual in steamships of the time. They could smolder for days. But it was nothing like a fire that would be raging uncontrollably. Historical timelines, crew logs, and structural analysis all indicate that a fire of such intensity and in such a position couldn't have caused fatal structural damage. If the fire had done that much harm, the ship might have failed even before the collision. But the Titanic stayed afloat for over 2 hours, which means the real villain was still the iceberg. Another twist to the fire story is that it could have distracted the crew, preventing them from dealing with the iceberg situation properly. That sounds more plausible, but still, that's not the same as saying the fire was the real culprit. Speaking of the real culprits, there's no doubt it was an iceberg, but the scale of disaster it caused was way more subtle than a big movie-style gash in the hull. Instead, it produced many tiny fractures in the ship's rivets, seams, and metal joints. Each fracture was almost unnoticeable, but because the ship was cruising, the water was steadily running through those micro gaps under pressure. It slowly seeped into multiple compartments and filled 6 of the watertight sections. The Titanic lingered, hovered, took on water, and was failing compartment after compartment. She sank over a period of 2 hours, rather than going down in minutes. If the iceberg had catastrophically torn open the hull, the ship would have gone down almost immediately, and people would have had no time to react and escape. Sadly, not all of them had that chance anyway. You probably recall the heartbreaking scene from the Titanic movie, where third-class passengers attempt to escape to the decks, but they are locked below in their section. Well, it's only partially true. Yes, there were barriers separating passenger classes, but they were mostly in place to comply with U.S. immigration laws. Third-class passengers going to America in search of a new life had to pass health checks and immigration processing. That's why they were traveling on separate decks. There were some lifeboats for them, although not in the third-class sections of the ship, so they would have to navigate a maze of corridors and stairs to reach the top. And many of the third-class passengers didn't even want to try, as they didn't want to leave their luggage behind. In the end, only about a quarter of the third-class passengers survived, but no one forcefully kept them on the lower decks. Now let's switch gears and discuss the Titanic facts that people used to deny or overlook, but which have since been proven true. For example, most deck plans and diagrams you've seen in Titanic documentaries don't show a hidden deck down under the waterline called the inner bottom. Many outside engineers did not fully understand or discuss it. This hidden deck stretched nearly the full length of the ship and had 44 separate watertight tanks. Most of them were for water ballast, some for fresh water. There were also wing tanks, port and starboard, which helped with balance. The inner bottom was like the ship's built-in organizer. It divided the Titanic into separate sections, allowing different parts to remain balanced and easier to control. It was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of the forward compartments flooded. Sadly, the rendezvous with the Iceberg opened 6 compartments, and you know what happened next. And finally, my personal favorite Titanic myth is that the ship split cleanly in half, like some Hollywood action scene. Blame James Cameron for that one. We all cried when we saw it, but reality was way uglier. For many years after the tragedy, survivors couldn't all agree on what they saw. Some said the ship went down whole. Others swore it broke apart. No one believed the second group until the scientists found the wreck in 1985. Then, they finally confirmed the truth that the Titanic had indeed broken in two, but not neatly. The metal twisted, tore, and shredded as the stern lifted into the air, and 2 opposite forces ripped it apart. And to make it even more tragic, the people were still clinging to the back half when it snapped and plunged into darkness.
Over 1,500 people lost their lives in this part of the ocean, so maybe it's a prudent idea to stay away from it. The spot where RMS Titanic sank remains dangerous. I mean, yeah, there are still huge icebergs out there, but there are even bigger threats lurking beneath the surface. Titanic is sitting about 12,500 feet underwater, nearly 400 miles southeast of Newfoundland. It's been down there for over 100 years. So, over time, the wreck's just been falling apart little by little. The infamous ship is rusting just like any iron or steel structure would be underwater. Chemically, when you mix iron, oxygen, and water, that combo sets off a reaction that creates iron oxide, and that's what leads to corrosion. So, steel plates, beams, all that stuff is getting weaker. Parts of the liner are caving in, like the ceiling in the captain's bathroom and a section of the railing that collapsed not too long ago. But in the case of Titanic, a lot of that corrosion is actually being caused by iron-eating bacteria. When the Titanic sank, it split into 2 big pieces, the bow and the stern, which landed nearly 2,000 feet apart on the ocean floor. And now both pieces are covered in this biofilm, a living blanket of bacteria, marine fungi, and all sorts of other microbes. Over time, microbes feeding on the ship's iron have created these things called rusticles, and they are actually speeding up the wreck's decay. Scientists say the stern is breaking down way faster than the bow, mostly because it took more damage when the ship sank. And now, thanks to all that bacterial activity, the stern could be deteriorating as much as 40 years ahead of the bow. So yeah, microbes have been thriving and flourishing down there. If you are a germaphobe, that probably sounds like a total nightmare. But honestly, it's not that bad. For one, they don't even look gross. These rusticles actually look kind of cool, like ice crystals or tiny diamonds clinging to the wreck. And don't worry, you are not in danger. As long as you keep a safe distance from the wreck, no direct contact, and definitely don't go poking around inside, there really is no risk. Speaking of getting dangerously close, we've got to mention the Titan submersible disaster. You know, the one that catastrophically imploded back in 2023 during a trip to the Titanic wreck. Sadly, all 5 people on board lost their lives. Even though this trip was sold as a tourist adventure, going that deep in the ocean is no joke. It's terrifying, cold, and dark. Sunlight gets absorbed by water and can't reach much farther than about 3,300 feet below the surface. Past that point, the ocean is in total darkness all the time. Titanic lies within a region known as the Midnight Zone for this very reason. The few brave people who have visited the wreck say the descent takes over 2 hours through complete darkness. Then, out of nowhere, the ocean floor just pops into view, lit up by the submersible's lights. The second big challenge is actually finding the wreck. At that depth, navigating is no easy task. When you reach the bottom, you really don't know exactly where you are. You're just kind of fumbling around in the dark, knowing that Titanic is somewhere down there, but you can't see it. However, detailed maps of the Titanic site, made from decades of high-res scans, really do help. As the wreck starts to come into view, they can use those maps to stay on track. Plus, sonar and sensors let the crew notice features and objects even if they're way beyond the sub's tiny light pool. For example, the Titan submersible had a sensor called the Doppler velocity log. This one sent out sound waves to measure how fast the sub is moving and how deep it is, based on its distance from the ocean floor. Still, passengers on previous trips to Titanic in this submersible have said how tough it is to find their way once they reach the ocean floor. And we can't forget about the pressure. The deeper you go in the ocean, the more pressure the water puts on everything. And the pressure is crazy high at the Titanic's wrecksite. To put it into perspective, it is about 200 times the pressure inside a car tire. That's why submersibles need super thick walls to handle it. So yeah, the water around Titanic has creepy microbes, pitch-black darkness, and insane pressure. But there is one more thing happening down there, and that's unpredictable currents. You're familiar with them. I mean, when you swim in the sea, you can usually feel the currents pulling you from side to side. But the deep ocean has its own set of underwater currents too. They're not as strong as the ones you feel on the surface, but they can still move massive amounts of water around. These currents can be caused by things like wind, differences in water temperature and salt, and even strange storms down on the ocean floor called benthic storms. They can get intense and stir up the sea bottom. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Titanic wreck is in two big pieces, the front and the back, and researchers have been checking out the seabed of the surrounding area. One part of the wreck is near this cold underwater current called the Western Boundary Undercurrent. It flows south and moves mud and sand along the ocean floor, creating ripples and patterns that show how strong or weak the current is. Most of the time, the currents there aren't very strong. They even found sand ripples near where all the Titanic debris landed, like furniture, coal, and just random stuff from the ship. And those ripples are showing a current flowing from east to west. But inside the main wreck site, things get a little wilder. The water flows more from northwest to southwest, probably because all the huge chunks of the ship are messing with the flow. Around the south side of Titanic's bow, the currents get unpredictable too. They keep switching directions, from northeast to northwest to even southwest. It's like the ocean's just doing its own thing down there. Experts think that over time, all this shifting water is going to slowly bury Titanic under layers of mud and sand. Little by little, the wreck could just fade away and disappear beneath the ocean floor. Alright, now it's time to get to the obvious issue here: icebergs. Yep, they're still a problem for ships today. In 2023, around 380 icebergs flowed into the busy shipping routes between North America and Europe. That's a problem. You see, the bigger the iceberg, the easier it is to spot and avoid. Smaller ice is a lot harder to detect, though it's no less dangerous. And that's because the most dangerous part is underwater, where no one can see it. Think about the iceberg that sank Titanic. Passengers saw about 100 feet of it above the water, but it's believed that's only 16% of its total size. Experts say the rest, hidden beneath the waves and much larger than what's visible, could stretch down several hundred feet. Now, the good news is that, unlike Titanic's day, we have much more technology now to spot icebergs in time. Modern ships have radar and satellite imagery that can pick up icy threats hiding in the dark. Some vessels even use sonar and thermal imaging to see through fog, helping the crew to spot icebergs above the surface. GPS and AIS pick safer routes, and monitoring centers around the globe send out real-time alerts, like having a personal iceberg spotting assistant. So, yes, it is a massive upgrade from just relying on binoculars. You won't have to worry about icebergs on your next cruise vacation, even if it passes alongside Titanic's route. But just to be extra safe, try not to travel with anyone named Jack or Rose, and never play the violin while on board. Just saying.
How could a ship built by the brightest minds of its time and called unsinkable go down in just 2 hours and 40 minutes? Maybe we can crack the mystery by diving deep into the bolts of the Titanic. And I mean that quite literally. It all started with a fancy dinner in London back in 1907. Lord William James Parry had a big idea and needed the right people on board. He invited the director of the British shipping company, White Star Line, over to chat. White Star was already riding the waves of success with transatlantic travel, making a fortune taking emigrants to America. But the competition was fierce. Cunard, one of their biggest rivals, had just launched 2 sleek, fast ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. These ships were the latest and greatest in both speed and luxury. Parry wasn't about to let that slide. As chairman of an Irish shipbuilding company, he figured if he teamed up with White Star, they could dominate the scene. That same night, over dinner, they started dreaming up an entire fleet of ocean liners. The Olympic, Titanic, and a third ship that eventually became the Britannic. Soon those ideas were being turned into reality. The construction of the Titanic and its twin, the Olympic, kicked off. It was such an impressive affair that they had to build 2 new shipyards on Queen's Island, known as Titanic Quarter, in Belfast Harbour. But building something that massive? Way easier said than done. Harland and Wolff, the British company behind the construction, had their hands full. This was the biggest ship anyone had ever tried to build, and it took 15,000 men working round the clock to make the dream happen. The Titanic and its twin were planned to be 882 feet long. It was just enough to stretch another 120 feet longer than the new Cunard liners. By the time it was finished, the Titanic stretched as long as 4 city blocks and high as a 9-story building. Aside from being the largest ship of the time, it also got another nickname. When Shipbuilder magazine went to examine it, they came up with the adjective unsinkable. But something went way too wrong along the way. If we made a quick X-ray of the Titanic, this is what we would find. 2,000 steel plates, each up to 30 feet long and weighing around 3 tons. To put it all together, they built it like a giant metal skeleton, with the keel acting as the backbone and the hull plates forming the outer shell. To beat the competition, the Titanic had to be huge, but it also had to be fast. So to make that happen, they needed to innovate on the ship's propellers. It had 3 propellers, 2 outer ones with 3 blades and 1 central propeller with 4 blades. The outer propellers, which were massive at 23 feet in diameter, were powered by the ship's steam engines. These engines were like the muscle of the ship, converting steam into the power that spun the propellers. The central propeller was a bit smaller, 17 feet across, and it was powered by a low-pressure steam turbine. The combination of engines and turbine was pretty cutting edge at the time and helped the Titanic cruise at about 21 knots. That's roughly 24 miles per hour, which doesn't sound too fast, but for a ship this size, it was impressive. The propellers themselves were made from manganese bronze, a material chosen because it's strong and resists corrosion. Trust me, this is key when you're plowing through salty ocean water. This engine system could produce up to 46,000 horsepower, which would be the equivalent horsepower of 230 cars combined. To make the ship move, there were 2 large propellers on the sides connected to engines that worked like giant pumps, pushing the ship forward. Then, there was a 3rd propeller in the middle, which worked as a steam turbine, a fancy kind of engine, to give it extra push and use less fuel. This whole setup wasn't just about power, it was also about speed. Other ships had started using the steam turbine a few years earlier, but since the Titanic was bigger and heavier, its system had to be extra powerful to keep it fast, stable, and comfortable for everyone on board. So, after 2 years of really hard work, the Titanic was ready for its first trial run. On May 31, 1911, a crowd of 100,000 people stopped to watch the Titanic slide into the River Lagan. Lord Peary was joined by American millionaire J.P. Morgan, who had acquired financial control of the White Star Shipping Company. The Titanic floated for the first time, but it took another year to fit it out, which is basically shipbuilding speak for turning that giant steel skeleton into a luxurious floating palace. It had it all: a heated swimming pool, Turkish baths, palm trees in the cafes, a squash court, a first-class dining salon that could fit 554 people. According to some reports, the most luxurious suite aboard the Titanic was booked by an American named Charlotte Drake Cardezza. She paid $2,500 in 1912. Even in today's money, that's a pretty penny for a trip. But if we make a conversion, it's gonna be around $75,000 in the 2020s. All for a one-way ticket across the Atlantic. Workers rushed to finish painting and polishing the Titanic by March 31, 1912. The 62-year-old White Star captain, Edward John Smith, went on board to oversee the final tests of the world's biggest ocean liner. The captain even said this would be his last Atlantic crossing. Once he got to America, he would retire. On April 10th, the ship was ready for its maiden voyage. It sailed to Southampton to take on coal and its first passengers. Passenger Sylvia Caldwell asked a deckhand if that gigantic ship was really unsinkable, to which he answered the iconic line that not even God himself could sink that ship. 4 days into the voyage, the RMS Titanic met its fate. Even though the ship got warnings about icebergs, it was gliding super fast in the dark. When the lookouts finally saw the iceberg, it was too close for the ship to stop or turn. Imagine trying to suddenly slam the brakes on a huge car. Now imagine that car was 20,000 times heavier than a normal vehicle and moving absurdly fast. When the Titanic tried to steer away, it ended up scraping the iceberg along its side. Even though the crew tried slowing down and turning, the ship sideswiped the iceberg, ripping open 100 meters of the hull, damaging 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. This caused the ship's front to dip underwater while the back lifted up, just like when one side of a lever gets too heavy. At a steep angle, the ship began to break in half from the middle, which is how it eventually sank. But why did the hull and rivets break so easily? A 1991 expedition discovered pieces of the Titanic's hull and found that the steel used was extremely brittle, especially in freezing temperatures like those on the night of the sinking. The steel didn't bend or give under pressure. It shattered like glass, making the impact much worse. Chemical testing also revealed that the steel had high levels of sulfur, which weakened it. This kind of brittle steel, combined with the high speed and freezing temperatures, was a recipe for disaster. Okay, there were material flaws, but the ship's design also had some serious issues. Those watertight compartments weren't fully sealed at the top. So as water flooded in, it spilled over from one compartment to another, speeding up the sinking process. If the ship had been built with better steel, a double hull, or improved watertight compartments, the disaster might have been avoided. Maybe even long enough for the RMS Carpathia to come and rescue everyone on board. The Titanic wasn't unsinkable, but for that time, it was a triumph of engineering and luxury. The thing is, even the best designs can't always beat nature. By April 1912, the Titanic was the most expensive and unsinkable ship in the world. These days, the sunken Titanic is associated with some of the most expensive expedition tours in the world. Despite the terrible tragedy, people have built profitable businesses using the famous ship, and these businesses can be very dangerous. The Titanic fell to the bottom of the icy waters of the North Atlantic in 1912. It was more than 70 years before people finally discovered the ship. It happened in the 80s when researcher Robert Ballard carried out a secret mission to search for sunken submarines. In addition to his mission, Ballard also wanted to search for the wreckage of the Titanic if he had the time. In short, he did find the Titanic. This discovery became the beginning of big profits, fighting for customers, lawsuits, and the destruction of the wreckage. Shortly after the discovery, Ballard came to the U.S. Congress and testified about the Titanic he'd found. He suggested making a sea memorial out of the wreck's site and leaving this place untouched. In 1986, Ballard installed a plaque on the Titanic, and the story ended there. But not for long. The Titanic tragedy was a popular theme, so many companies realized they could make a lot of money out of it. In 1987, an American company, Titanic Ventures, descended to the wreckage together with the French National Institute of Oceanography and got about 1,800 artifacts from there. Then the company received the rights from the US government to rescue the Titanic by parts. Over the course of several years, they made several other expeditions and took more than 2,000 artifacts. The company created a museum where it exhibited the found jewelry, interior elements, personal belongings of passengers, and a lot more. Some artifacts were put up for auction. The company made good profits and inspired many others to do the same. For example, let's take a look at this pocket watch. It belonged to a guy named Edmund Stone, who was a first-class steward. The watch stopped at 2:15 a.m. when it fell into the icy ocean water. After almost 100 years, it was sold for 130,000 euros, which is about $135,000, and is far from the highest price. Another item is the Titanic's ship plan. This is one of the most authentic artifacts from the ship, and it had a practical use. Experts used this blueprint to investigate the wreckage. It helped them understand where the iceberg had struck the Titanic. This plan was sold at auction for $320,000. Do you remember that moment in the movie when the ship began to sink and the violinist started playing their last song? It was actually true. There were real musicians on board who were playing till the end. One of them was Wallace Hartley. Unfortunately, he didn't survive the disaster, but his violin did. Even though it's impossible to play it, it was sold for $1.5 million. In general, as you understand, the hunt for the Titanic's artifacts turned out to be quite profitable. Then, director James Cameron came down to the Titanic. In 1997, he released his famous movie with the same name, and the popularity of the Titanic soared. Collecting the artifacts was no longer so interesting. People wanted to go down to the famous ship on their own. The high demand provided a good supply. In 1998, British company Deep Ocean Expeditions organized tours to the Titanic for only $32,500. From that time until 2012, the company conducted 197 dives to the wreckage of the ship, and during this time, the ticket price doubled. The company Titanic Ventures, which was the first to get an artifact from the sunken ship, later received the name RMS Titanic Inc., and it sued Deep Ocean Expeditions because it believed that its exclusive rights to salvage the ship's artifacts prevented other companies from conducting underwater tours. RMS Titanic won the court case and banned Deep Ocean from conducting expeditions, but this decision was overturned in 1999. In short, litigation and fights between competitors began. People continued to go down to the seabed to see the legendary ship. There were other companies that organized their own tours. Tourists descended to the Titanic inside underwater bathyscaphs. In 2001, an American couple had a wedding inside an underwater vessel that floated next to the Titanic deck. The profit was growing, customers were coming, and everything was fine, not counting the Titanic itself. The more tourists came down to the ship, the more damaged it got. People wanted not only to see, but also to touch the wreckage. The bathyscaphs could accidentally hit the ship and break apart its parts. The churning of the water caused by boat propellers could also damage the old ship. During one expedition, a bathyscaphe crashed into the Titanic, but those who did it kept silent about this incident. In addition, the seabed where the ship lies is littered with garbage. Bottles, chains, weights, nets that people left during rescue operations and tourism. More than 100 years after the tragedy, the Titanic has finally received UNESCO protection. This means that many countries have received the right to prohibit going down to the Titanic, taking artifacts from there and selling them. The saddest thing is that this hype around the Titanic led to another tragedy. In 2023, Ocean Gate Expeditions conducted a tour on a submarine with 5 people. This was the famous Titan bathyscaphe you've probably heard about. So, the Titan began its dive to the Titanic, and after 1 hour and 45 minutes, communication with the bathyscaphe was lost. Something broke in the boat, depressurization started, and in a split second, the huge water pressure crushed the Titan. Despite the danger of such a dive, there are many people who want to go on an expedition to the Titanic to see the ship with their own eyes. They're not even deterred by the price of such a tour, which has increased by several times. But for those who don't have several $100,000, oceanographers and divers have created a digital copy of the sunken Titanic. Using a computer, you can visit the ship, walk through its halls, cabins, and deck. The copy has preserved some parts of the ship which don't exist anymore. For example, the famous railings on the ship's bow where Leonardo DiCaprio hugged Kate Winslet have recently collapsed. And you can also visit museums dedicated to the Titanic. There, you'll see various photos, elements of the ship, personal belongings of passengers, and many other artifacts. Anyway, if you have a lot of money and you still want to go down to the Titanic, think twice. And in general, ordinary scuba diving is a rather dangerous thing. These are the problems it can cause. When you dive underwater without preparation and come up too fast, you're likely to encounter decompression sickness, which is also called the bends. Due to the rapid decrease in the pressure that surrounds you, nitrogen bubbles move through the body and might cause paralysis, severe discomfort, spinal cord damage, and many other troubles. Wait a minute, what are nitrogen bubbles doing in your body anyway? Your cylinders contain compressed gas that consists of nitrogen and oxygen. And when you inhale this substance and the pressure around you sharply decreases, nitrogen accumulates in bubbles. According to Henry's law, the solubility of gases in a liquid is directly proportional to the external pressure. The liquid is flowing in your veins and arteries, and the external pressure is tons of seawater around you. Any change in your body pressure can also cause loss of consciousness, and underwater depths are not the best place to faint. Check out on YouTube what happens to people who don't adhere to safety regulations and experience the bends. You'll see that this is a rather unpleasant feeling. What if you get a bad instructor, or you panic and start rising too fast? Or the depth might turn out greater than you expected. Of course, when you're inside a bathyscaphe, looking at the Titanic through the window, you feel much more comfortable. But if you're going to scuba dive to big depths, good preparation is vital for you.